Hank, you can start. People are almost here. So as I was saying,
okay.
Hank Time Half is going to connect and give the his presentation, the keynote presentation from Holland, and it's basically on related to global bioethics and the environment. He's the author of Wounded Planet, which is somehow related to this this topic. And originally we had these keynote speakers going to frame the whole discussion from a more global, more a wider perspective, and then go into the individual discussions. But due to the time difference, we slated his conference in the afternoon instead of in the morning. So we welcome you, Tom. You can, Hank. You can go ahead with your presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I am trying to give you a brief overview of the role of the notion of the environment in the context of the International Organization of UNESCO. And what I will do is I will first show the involvement with the environment in a broader sense. Then secondly, the relation of ethics and the environment. Then also what is exemplified regarding that relationship in the Bioethics Declaration, and especially Article 17, which is focused on protection of the environment. And then one of the implications of the article is also the concern with traditional knowledge. And then I will proceed to conclusions. So the idea is that the international community was early on after the Second World War interested and concerned with the environment. And we can see that in the establishment of a specific UN organization, UN program, UNEP.
Excuse me, Hank, can you do the slideshow? We're still on the first slide.
Yeah.
You're not doing the slideshow, I think. Or it's showing the, it's not showing the slideshow.
Because I see my slides moving, but
yes, but I think it's on a different screen.
On a different
the screen of the slideshow and not the screen of the PowerPoint.
Right.
Yeah, this is it. Good, thanks.
This is it? Okay. This was just the outline of my talk. The first issue is that the international community is since a long time concerned with the environment. And an example is the establishment of UNEP already in '72. But UNESCO, is the organization in the UN system focused on science, education, and culture. And it has various activities regarding the environment. And one, of course, is in the area of education, ecological education. But they also have scientific programs focused on particular dimensions of the environment. And maybe the most well-known program is the Man and the Biosphere program, where you have certain specific spaces, areas in all over the world that are considered to be protected areas. And then, of course, also this is related to the program of the Culture Department, where they have designated heritage sites all over the world to protect cultural heritage. But now they have also programs to protect natural heritage. And here you see that there are biosphere reserves and global geoparks, which are all characterized by their uniqueness in relation to the environment. So this is a more general concern with the environment that exists already since a long time. But if we look at the ethics and the environment, then also in the context of UNESCO, the member states have adopted 3 international standard setting instruments. One is already from the 90s, a declaration on the responsibilities of the present generations towards future generations. And here you see for clear formulation of an article concerning protection of the environment, but the whole idea that we also have to be concerned about future generations is underlined in this declaration. Now, it was some of these ideas were elaborated and repeated in the Universal Declaration on Bioethics, specifically in the context of bioethics, that you now have as one of the basic principles of bioethics, the principle of protection of the environment, the biosphere, and biodiversity. And this was further elaborated in the more recent declaration of ethical principles in relation to climate change, where the focus is very much on sustainable development. Now here you see the articles of the older declaration regarding future generations. And here it is more elaborate, what do we mean by that? And what are the relevant considerations? And one of the relevant considerations is, of course, the idea of common heritage of humankind, which is important in the context of UNESCO. Now, in the more recent declaration, you see a limited number of articles that are also referring to scientific and ethical principles. And you see here clearly the emphasis is on sustainable development, but you will recognize some of the principles from the Bioethics Declaration, for example, that are also reiterated here. And then, of course, the most important one if we talk about bioethics is the Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights, adopted in 2005. And it is important to remember what are the aims of the declaration. It is to provide a framework of principles for states, because UNESCO is an organization of member states, so the first actor to address are member states. It can help them to formulate policies and legislation in the field of bioethics. But the declaration also explicitly is aiming at the activities of individuals, groups, communities, institutions, corporations, and any entity, an individual involved in bioethical debate, for example, pharmaceutical companies. And it also refers here to the idea of present and future generations, because that is more or less the system of international organizations. They are building on what kind of agreement already has established. And they reiterated that agreement. But it also refers to the importance of biodiversity and the conservation of biodiversity as a common concern of humankind. And then the declaration formulates 15 ethical principles that should help to implement these aims. Now, it's also important to look at the preamble of the declaration, and here you see several references to the environment. And I think the importance of the declaration is that it uses a broader concept of bioethics, not only focused on medical or clinical issues, not only focused on social dimensions, a social context, but specifically also bringing into the field of bioethics this concern with the environment related to future generations. Also the idea that human beings are an integral part of the biosphere. So they have a kind of responsibility for other forms of life. And this is kind of in the preamble, it reminds the readers of the concerns and the activities that have been important in the past, and that should guide the development of principles. Now here you see the list of principles. And the important thing is that these principles, they actually go from the individual perspective. that was very clear in the traditional approach of bioethics, benefit and harm, autonomy, to concern with communities, concern with societies and cultures, to, in the end, a concern with the survival of humankind, the world as a whole. And so you see a range of principles, and the most important one for this presentation are, of course, the last ones of future generations, protection of future generations, and protection of the environment and biodiversity. Now, this is the Article 17 on the protection of the environment, the biosphere, and biodiversity. And you see it's formulated in the typical language of international declarations without being too specific about what it actually entails. That you should give due regard to the interconnection between human beings and other forms of life, to the importance of appropriate access and utilization of biological and genetic resources, to respect for traditional knowledge, and to the role of human beings in the protection of the environment, the biosphere, and biodiversity. Now, you know that this is, in fact, a kind of complicated text in which several concerns are seemingly merged. And here you see that the first thing to clarify is they talk about the environment, but also about the biosphere and biodiversity. And this is, maybe you could say, well, why do they do that? One reason could be that UNESCO already has programs in the field of biosphere. They have this biosphere reserves as specific areas of land where the idea is that the local population is supported because they preserve biodiversity and they made sustainable use of the resources that are available. And also biodiversity is a concept that has been often used in the context of UNESCO. And here you see how it is often described, in which terms and what we should envision by this term biodiversity. Now, another thing is protection of the environment. And here they also build on previous activities that in the Declaration on Responsibilities of the present generations toward future generations, there is an article protection of the environment. And here you see the different sub-articles of that article, which is reminded also when you read the Bioethics Declaration that we should make sure that future generations may have the same benefits from the earth as we have, so that we should not use all the resources to the detriment of future generations. We have a duty or an obligation, moral obligation towards these future generations to make sustainable use of the present resources of the earth. So this is a kind of more clarification of these three notions, but there are also other statements there that are interesting. The first is the idea of the interconnection between human beings and other forms of life, which is clearly was at the time of the discussions about the declaration not the main concern of bioethics. And this formulation has specifically brought into the debate by representatives from Asian countries, because their argument was that man is not simply an autonomous individual living on his own, like it usually is in Western liberalism, but that man is part. Sorry?
तो अब आपको फोटो नहीं दिखेगा उनका बड़ा, आपको छोटा ही दिख रहा है क्योंकि इन्होंने अपनी स्क्रीन शेयर की हुई है। जब ये अपनी स्क्रीन शेयर करें तो ये खुद छोटे दिखेंगे, ये स्क्रीन बड़ी दिखेगी। ये पूरी स्क्रीन तो हमारी बड़ी है। हाँ ये हाँ ये हाँ ये अब हमें इनसे सवाल देख
सर मैं सवाल पूछता तो हम कैसे पूछेंगे?
Okay.
Yes. Yes.
We're talking about the interconnection between human beings and other forms of life. And I was arguing that this point was particularly emphasized by representatives from Asian countries. And it's also articulated in the preamble that human beings are an integral part of the biosphere. And they have a particular responsibility, a particular role in protecting one another and other forms of life. There also is specific reference to biological and genetic resources. And that is also because UNESCO has focused earlier on the issue of genetics, that they were afraid that genetics was a development in the richer countries, that the other low-income countries could not benefit from the progress of scientific knowledge, especially in the field of genetics. So that's why UNESCO member states adopted earlier a declaration on the human genome and on human genetic data. So, and that is why they also articulated this point here. So the environment is also a rich resource in biological and genetic terms for the development of new medication, food, and all kinds of resources that humans are using. So we should also be concerned about the use of these resources and the preservation of these resources for future generations. That's why in the context of bioethics, they are specifically referring here to biological and genetic resources as important in biodiversity. And then also, finally, there is a reference to traditional knowledge. And this was emphasized also in the preamble. So, well, and that is related to the cultural focus of UNESCO. That is, human cultures, they are very diverse, but they have developed all kinds of traditional knowledge that we need to preserve, we need to consider, and that need to be in a certain way protected. UNESCO has several programs to collect and protect traditional knowledge in that sense. And this is also the concern that the environment in many areas of the world is closely connected to indigenous populations who used to care for the environment, who have developed traditional knowledge over a long period of time. And we need to make sure that these communities are at least respected. Now, the question is, what is, if we look more closer to this traditional knowledge, what is traditional knowledge? And there is, of course, a whole debate about what we should consider as traditional knowledge. And here you see what is regarded as a kind of definition, but in fact is a larger description of what we understand by traditional knowledge. And here you see we have the relation with indigenous people. They live in the environment and therefore have built extensive knowledge of the environment over centuries. They know how to understand the properties of plants and animals, the functioning of ecosystems, and they have developed techniques for managing ecosystems. So this is a kind of valuable knowledge if we want to promote sustainable use of the environment. And therefore we need to attend. We cannot simply impose our scientific and Western policies in order to preserve the environment, but we have to take into account that humankind all over the globe has already developed a substantial knowledge about how to do that. And here you see also we speak about traditional knowledge, indigenous knowledge, and local knowledge, all kinds of different words for the same type of knowledge. And in UNESCO, this is regarded as cultural property of humankind. So we need to be very clear that this is well preserved and protected. Now, characteristics of traditional knowledge, there are many characteristics known, but I can say, well, some of them are listed here. It's based on experiences, not theoretical knowledge, but it's based on experiences that people have discovered, the healing power of some plants, and therefore have developed a kind of medication over centuries that is used for particular ailments. We also see that traditional knowledge is related to the different circumstances of the country. You have different knowledge in high and low temperature areas. It is also generally holistic. It is related to spiritual health, the language, culture, the way of life. And it's also a kind of system where you have clear rules and obligations towards protecting the environment. And in a certain way, people say it's a way of life because it is the wisdom accumulated over a long period of time in a particular kind of people. But the focus generally is on sustainability because indigenous people know that their existence is tightly connected to the sustainability of the environment. They also are concerned with future generations, and they see themselves embedded in the environment and closely related to non-human beings. Now, it means that the concept of traditional knowledge, indigenous knowledge, is much broader than our Western concept of knowledge. And you see it also in the way traditional knowledge is exemplified. It's not only text or literature, but it can be art, music, all kinds of cultural symbols that are used to express the cultural concerns of a particular people. So, and in this sense, it is more, I already said, it's more holistic. It bridges separations that usually exist in our Western culture. And therefore, you can say if it's interesting for bioethical perspective, because the founder of the word bioethics, Potter, has already argued that bioethics itself should act like a bridge. It should try to overcome separations that are used in our traditional thinking, that we need to have a bridge between the present and the future, with the emphasis on traditional future generations. We need to bridge the separation between science and values, between nature and culture, and between humans and nature. So these connecting activities are much clearer, we can argue, in what used to be traditional knowledge. Traditional knowledge in the context of healthcare is, of course, related to the idea of traditional medicine. And we see that WHO has also started a program to protect traditional medicine. It's the, you could say, it's the articulation, the exemplification of the idea of traditional knowledge in the field of medicine and healthcare. And there are many systems of traditional medicine, of course. We now assume that Western medicine is the dominant approach and the only viable approach, but humankind always had systems of traditional medicine. And one of the specific issues in relation to traditional medicine and traditional knowledge, of course, in bioethics, which was also in the background of the discussions of the Bioethics Declaration, is the practice of biopiracy. That because many indigenous populations have traditional knowledge, that you see that sometimes outside people are stealing this kind of knowledge and are trying to patent the knowledge so that they can make medication that is only available on the market, while in traditional indigenous communities, it was freely available for all. And this is generally regarded as an unjust practice, but it was quite common for a long time, and most of our effective medication in the West is in fact derived or based on traditional knowledge from different parts of the world. So this is a kind of clear problem of discrepancy between the North and the South that the Declaration also tries to cover. That we say we should have one approach and one kind of principles, and therefore respect for traditional knowledge is very important because it is providing justice to populations that have developed their knowledge over a long period of time. Now, in conclusion, what I've been arguing is that protection of the environment, as formulated in the Bioethics Declaration, has become an important principle of bioethics. And one awareness that we certainly have nowadays is that the environment and a deterioration of the environment and the biosphere have serious impact on health, disease, drugs, food, and water. So our health, and if bioethics is concerned with health, then health is seriously endangered by the degradation of the environment. And therefore, concern with the environment should be part of bioethics. And then also, because of this, we need in bioethics a broader perspective, not only focus on the individual, on clinical concerns, but also we should focus on the social context in which individuals are living and the environmental context in which they live. And that's the reason why also in my talk, in the title of my talk, I have references to global bioethics. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Hank. So now we'll go to a presentation from Dennis Chang, who's going to speak from Hong Kong. At the end of these two presentations, we will have the question and answers at time. We already have some questions from the chat, from Dr. Shaw from India, but we'll wait for the questioning and answering at the end of the two talks. So Dennis, you may proceed.
Thank you very much. You can see the title of my talk is Integral Ecology, Natural Order, and the Relational Self. I put a question mark after the word New Ecological Age towards a post-secular synthesis in a new ecological age. Well, this is the famous Earthrise photograph of the planet Earth. Our goal says that it exploded into the consciousness of humankind, and within 2 years gave birth to the modern environmental movement. Not quite the birth of an ecological age. This is another view of the planet Earth. And then you can visualize greenhouse warming. And these are monks in Bangkok ordaining a tree to save forests. Now, greetings to all of you in Bangkok and friends online. As you know, Thailand is a signatory to the Paris Agreement of 2015 and has drafted its first climate change bill to provide for a legislative framework for adaptation, mitigation, and other measures. And now we are at the countdown to the Conference of Parties 27 to be held in Egypt in November this year. You know that the goal of the Paris Agreement, which is 2015, is to limit global warming this century to well below 2, preferably to 1.5 degrees Celsius, compared to pre-industrial levels, and to achieve climate neutrality by 2050. The IPCC has sounded its starkest warnings yet about impending climate change-induced calamities. Now, the US has joined the Paris Agreement, and both the US and China and also India have made pledges. Now, Pope Francis Laudato Si was in the same year as the Paris Agreement. And the UN endorsed the Sustainable Development Goals also in the same year, in September of that year. You can see that the Laudato Si was on the 24th of May, 2015. Now, it's important to have a look very quickly at the 17 SDGs. Although climate action is number 13, if you look at the rest of the SDGs, they are all in some way related. You look at number 1, no poverty, and number 2, zero hunger, and so on. Now, in the same year, 2015, the Stockholm Resilience Center revised its 2009 report, and then reported that at least 4 of the 9 planetary boundaries have been breached. And these are the climate change, biodiversity, land system change, biochemical flaws, nitrogen and phosphorus. You can look at, there's a figure there, very important, which is 350 ppm. That is the figure relating to the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Now, it actually was overshot. There was overshoot. And you can see in the year 2010, that figure has already been overshot from the safe zone of operating space to the next one, which is the uncertain zone. Now, so when Pope Francis issued the encyclical, there was already a breach of 4 of the 9 planetary boundaries. This is accepted by the UN. And in 2022, I noticed that 2 additional planetary boundaries have been breached. And that relates to water, to the water cycle, and to the green water. So what is integral ecology? Now, the integral ecology principle, everything is interconnected. Now, it brings together 5 ecologies: environmental, economic, social, cultural, and everyday life ecologies, plus the ethical principles of the common good, human rights, intergenerational justice, and not just inter, but also intra, so as between generations and within generations. And then the intrinsic value of nature. And the environment is a relationship existing between nature and the society which lives in it. And we know that nature cannot be regarded as something separate from ourselves or as a mere setting in which we live. We are part of nature, included in it, and thus in constant interaction with it. His encyclical was addressed to every person living on this planet, and it urgently appeals for a new dialogue about how we are shaping the future of our planet. Because St. Francis of Assisi The title is taken from the first sentence of the Canticle of Creatures. It's put forward as the model of wonderful simplicity and harmony with God, with others, with nature, and with himself. And his care for the vulnerable, and of an integral ecology lived out joyfully and authentically as someone who was concerned for God's creation and for the poor and outcast. Now, the terms ecology and environment, Ernst Haeckel coined the word in 1866. The Greek word for dwell is oikos. Oikos means home or household. Ecology is the relationships between organisms inter se and the external conditions or surroundings. Look at Heidegger's thinking. It was that ecology speaks of our dwelling on earth. You know that Heidegger loves to hyphenate words. And environment is, of course, the external conditions or surroundings of organisms. In fact, the term integral ecology was first time used in 1958 by the marine biologist Hilary B. Moore in his book, Marine Biology to Unite All Ecologies into a Coherent Perspective. And Leonardo Boff in 1997, in an article actually published in Concilium, he called Cry of the Earth, Cry of the Poor. It's a framework that allows all aspects of reality to connect with what has traditionally been associated with the scientific study of ecology. Now, Pope Francis, of course, picked up the phrase, the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. And he says that a true ecological approach always becomes a social approach. It must integrate questions of justice in debates on the environment, so as to be able to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. It must be an integrated approach to combating poverty, restoring dignity to the excluded, and at the same time protecting nature. We are part of nature, included in it, and thus in constant interaction with it. Climate is a common good, belonging to all and meant for all. And then he goes, in chapter 1, he's describing what is happening to our common home, so pollution, waste, throwaway culture, global warming, and so on. And he speaks of an ecological debt. Now, he acknowledges that human activity is the primary driver of this warming, and the importance of development of renewable energy sources and related storage capacity. Man is made to the image of God, that's Imago Dei, and he says that there can be no ecology without an adequate anthropology. And in chapter 2, he goes to the gospel of creation, and he makes the point that creation is broader in meaning than nature. Every creature has its own value, and then speaks of responsible stewardship and protection of nature. He rejects the domination thesis interpretation of the Bible, and he speaks of the environment as a collective good, a gift, a message of each creature in harmony with creation, a common inheritance. So every creature has its own purpose. None is superfluous. Now let's look at, therefore, the three models very quickly. And one is the absolute dominion model. Now you can see I put CF before Genesis. The Pope rejects this as a misinterpretation of Scripture, and he calls it a misguided or excessive anthropocentrism. Next model is the responsible stewardship model. Now, he accepts this model, but he accepts it as well. He accepts the third model at the same time. And the third model is the call to universal communion. Now, this is accepting the world as a sacrament of communion, down to the last speck of dust of our planet. In the spirit of St. Francis, who communed with all creation, with a sense of fraternity, which excludes nothing and no one. Now, when one bears in mind that Christians believe in the incarnation, there is this incarnational model. We'll come back to that perhaps in a moment. Now, he then speaks about the human roots of the ecological crisis, and he speaks of the technocratic paradigm. And chapter 4 is entirely devoted to integral ecology, the ecology of daily living. 5 is on lines of approach and action, political life, international agreements, and so on. So it's we have to look at the real world, not just pious propositions. Chapter 6, it goes back to education and spirituality, and then basic human rights. The access to safe, drinkable water is a basic and universal human right. The global north owes an ecological debt to the south, but committed to commercial imbalances with effects on the environment and the disproportionate use of natural resources by certain countries. The cry of the poor again. We're faced not with two separate crises, but rather with one complex crisis, which is both social and environmental. It speaks of ecological conversion, and there's many dimensions. Now, what is deep ecology? Biocentrism, ecocentrism, and the Gaia hypothesis. Now, biocentrism assigns an equal value or moral status to all living things. Now, Pope Francis was insisting that everything in nature has an intrinsic value as part of creation. He says that human beings do have a special dignity because they are rational beings made in the image of God and, of course, redeemed by Jesus Christ. Ecocentrism goes beyond biocentrism by placing intrinsic value on non-living things as well, such as the ecosystems like lakes, rivers, mountains, etc. So distinguishing it from both biocentrism and anthropocentrism. Now, in Laudato Si, the Pope insisted that each organism and ecosystem has intrinsic value. Each organism, as a creature of God, is good and admirable in itself. The same is true of the harmonious ensemble of organisms existing in a defined space and functioning as a system. Just to make sure that the next sentence is not mistaken for that of the Pope, it is actually from me. The fact that something living or not has intrinsic, or I call it ontic value, because the value comes by the mere fact of existence, of being created. The fact that something living or not has intrinsic or ontic value does not mean that it does not or cannot have instrumental value. You can have both intrinsic and instrumental value. Now, but in deep ecology, that is not so. They say that everybody is an equal moral sort of status to be given to everything. is a so-called ecosophy. No single species of living being has more the right to live and unfold than any other species. Annie Ness was inspired by Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. Heidegger was sometimes co-opted by the radical environmental movement. The deep ecologists maintain that Heidegger's thinking called us to dwell authentically on this earth, parallel to our call to dwell in our bioregion and to dwell with alertness to the natural processes. Now, a statement like that, I don't find anything wrong with that. I mean, yes, I mean, we are called to dwell. Dwellings are important, habitats are important. And this it can give rise to a sort of land ethics. According to Bruce Foltz, Heidegger's idea of dwelling is necessarily an act of tending and attending that allow things to disclose themselves rather than to exploit them, to be a genuine caretaker. Again, I don't find any problem with that. It's very, I would subscribe to that. But I do have a fundamental query because Heidegger goes on to say that there are no limits to technology, that nature should be challenged. Now, the gay hypothesis, James Lovelock developed in the 1960s, the idea of planet Earth and all the living things together with the non-living environments form one living, self-regulating super organism. Now, a lot of criticisms from a lot of people regarding this. But in any event, we will leave that. And now, Whitehead and John B. Cobb, his process philosophy and theology. You see, in the year, again, 2015, that's the year of the of Laudato Si, there was a famous international Whitehead conference held called Seizing an Alternative Toward an Ecological Civilization. And it maintains that an organic, relational, integrated, non-dualistic, and processive conceptuality is needed. And John B. Cobb and other process philosophers and theologians claim that Whitehead could be the philosopher of ecological civilization. Now, it appears that Whitehead, this Whitehedian process scholarship, is actually quite prominent in the People's Republic of China. And in 2017, President Xi Jinping announced the commitment to a new ecological civilization in the party's constitution. We'll come back to that in a moment. Now, but note that Whitehead and other process philosophers recognize both the intrinsic as well as the instrumental values of nature. But what is the natural order? The book of nature is one and indivisible. Now, human ecology also implies another profound reality, the relationship between human life and the moral law, which is inscribed in our nature and is necessary for the creation of a more dignified environment. So Pope Benedict spoke of an ecology of man based on the fact that man too has a nature that he must respect and that he cannot manipulate at will. He must therefore accept the natural and moral structures with which he is endowed. Our body itself establishes us in a direct relationship with the environment and with other living beings. And the acceptance of our bodies as God's gift is vital for welcoming and accepting the entire world as a gift from the Father and our common home. Whereas thinking that we enjoy absolute power over our own bodies turns often subtly into thinking that we enjoy absolute power over creation. We have to develop a creation consciousness and learn to read the grammar inscribed in nature. that's related to the use and abuse of technology. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, the word creation is broader meaning than nature, for it has to do with God's plan, loving plan, in which every creature has its own value and significance. Interventions on nature are legitimate if these are meant to be beneficial and are performed responsibly, that is to say, by acknowledging the grammar inscribed in nature and by using resources for the health of all. Healthcare is inseparable from earth care. For a long time, this meant being in tune with and respecting the possibilities offered by the things themselves. It was a matter of receiving what nature itself allowed as if from his own hand. By contrast, we are the ones now to lay our hands on things, attempting to extract everything possible from them. Now, naturalistic fallacy or physicalism. The moral law inscribing nature is not to be confused with mere physical laws of nature. A man who kills himself by jumping from a high building has no choice but to comply with the law of gravitation, even if he's acting against the natural law of self-preservation. So we must not confuse between mere physical laws of nature and what is called sometimes the natural law. Some see the natural order as a little more than the orderly systems and things within them comprising what is given naturally in the physical universe. Some see it as encompassing the natural relations of beings to one another in the absence of human positive law. And others see it as the proximate source of the natural moral law, regardless of whether there is also a divinely revealed law or an eternal law as an ultimate source. And the natural law and natural rights. Cicero speaks of a true law as right reason in agreement with nature. Now, embodied human reason is part of nature. It's part of the natural order, expressed in terms of the order of creation. What is contrary to right reason is also contrary to the first principles of natural moral law, including ecoethics and so on. And basic human rights are claims of right which human beings have simply by virtue of being human. They are not state-conferred. They are the expression of normative values based on basic human needs or goods and equal intrinsic worth and dignity, translated into claims of right and universal norms, or at least the right to have rights with the correlative duties rooted in our shared humanity. Now, what about the rights of nature? Can legal personhood be given to an ecosystem? Now, I've given here examples of places, countries, where in fact there is either constitutional protection or some legal protection or legal personhood being conferred on ecosystem, on rivers, lakes, and so on. And Ecuador in 2008 was the first country to confer constitutional protection to the rights of Pachamama or Mother Earth, and then Bolivia adopted the framework law of Mother Earth. New Zealand awarded the Wanganui River legal personhood and guardianship by a joint council. And in 2014, the national park, there was a former, an ancient national park, was given legal recognition in its own rights. And so you have got protection of the indigenous peoples. In Colombia, in 2016, where a parliamentary ombudsman was actually appointed, was actually authorized to stop illegal forestry. And then Supreme Court in Colombia in 2018, and in India in 2017, long line of Hindu sacred deities were given juristic status. In line with that, the court there ruled in two cases that the Ganges River and Yamuna rivers and two glaciers should be treated as legal minors. And so the Indian court refers to rivers, forests, lakes, and so on as having the right to exist. Now, of course, none of these changes the fact the rights of nature are not self-executing, and that, in fact, you need human beings to protect nature. The record of climate litigation so far cannot be said to be generally successful. and sometimes actually create problems, a lot of problems, because it actually creates a sort of adversarial relationship, and almost like nature going against human beings, vis-a-vis human beings and so on. So this is something which is, there are lots of pros and cons, and the European, there's a report, a study in the European context, which actually exposes and explores the problems. Now there's one important point is that when you look at the Article 71 of the Ecuadorian Constitution, it proclaims that nature, or Pachamama, has a right to integral respect for its existence. Now, this word, I would suggest, is very useful because it does not say equal respect to human beings, but integral respect. In other words, respect for its integrity. It is not the same sort of formulation when you come to intrinsic human rights, human beings, the intrinsic dignity of human beings, where you use the word equal intrinsic value, but simply it's an integral respect. And now the next is, what is the relational self? Now the Confucian relational self is interpersonal, communal, and genealogical. It is intergenerational solidarity. And relationships are important to a Confucian, but the person who makes the relationship possible cannot simply be reduced or forfeited within the relations. So that is on the special characteristics of the Confucian relational self. But more generally, is the root to the ecological crisis self-centeredness and conceit. And when we look at the individual self, the motivational primacy of the individual self is an atomistic or monadic I at the center of the moral universe, whereas the relational self is motivated by an empathetic I and thou in significant relationships, typically dyadic, though not necessarily so. And the collective self is driven by an undifferentiated we and us of the collectivity. Now, Martin Buber's I and thou is that more attuned to creation consciousness than I. Now, I have in the article on human rights and relational self, define relational self as follows: that is embodied, that is affective, and that is relational, and is embedded in a web of relationships that crucially include close nested relationships, but also extend beyond family, friends, faith communities, and other groups. It has a spiritual and universal dimension, including ecological, with an awareness and care for ourselves and stewardship of the environment. So the Confucian relationship self actually, with its the essence of or the most important cardinal virtue in Confucianism is Ren, which is benevolence. And there's a very famous passage in Confucian, which is the Zhongyong in the Doctrine of the Mean, that it is only he who possesses the most complete sincerity that can exist under heaven, who can give his full development to his own nature, and by reason of that ability, he can do the same to the nature of other men. And then he can give the full development to natures of animals and things. And then he may, with heaven and earth, form a Ternian, which is unity of heaven, earth, and humanity in harmony. Now, I briefly, I go to the question is, what is post-secularity? And there is a need for continuing dialogue and between faith and reason. The question is, given the visibility of religious views and concerns in the public square, should a more inclusive framework be pursued than an exclusively secular or secularist one? Habermas. Now, his paradigm of post-secularity does not envisage a public square that is desecularized. He has two critical edges. Secular citizens must develop a post-secular consciousness with a principled openness to the religious argument in the public square. And religious citizens must develop modernization of religious consciousness with an epistemic stance that is successful only to the extent that it respects the fact of pluralism without contradicting their own faith. So, in fact, Habermas' secularism actually privileges secularity. It allows secularism actually to, as well, capture the religious sphere. But with regard to secular citizens, the requirement is for a post-secular consciousness and a principled openness to the religious argument in the public square. Now, in Singapore, there's a very interesting model called secularism with a soul, forming part of the policy of relational constitutionalism and the management of religious disputes. Now, I have described Habermas' stance. And there's a dialogue between Ratzinger and Habermas, and Ratzinger disapproves of an aggressive and unhealthy secularism, but he did not deny that the secular, as properly understood, has its own sphere of autonomy. And he accepts that there's a need to translate spiritual values into secular language or natural reasons of Aquinas. So post-secularity, therefore, does not mean a desecularized public square, which religion has reclaimed for itself. It means that religion is not excluded from the public square, but given its proper and rightful place. Now, the convergences towards a new ecological civilization. Laudato Si says, we need to develop a new synthesis capable of overcoming the false arguments of recent centuries. So the dialogue between faith and reason may well result in a synthesis which transforms our understanding of the natural order and the meaning of unity in plurality. It goes beyond Habermas' concept of post-secularity. And again in 2015, that's the year again of the Laudato Si, the Parliament of the World's Religions declared, the future we embrace will be a new ecological civilization and a world of peace, justice, and sustainability. With the flourishing of the diversity of life, we will build this future as one human family within the greater Earth community. And in 2017, President Xi Jinping declared that the Communist Party has built into its constitution a commitment to a new ecological civilization. And this is what he says: man and nature form a community of life. We as human beings must respect nature, follow its ways, and protect it. Only by observing the laws of nature can mankind avoid costly blunders in its exploitation. Any harm we inflict on nature will eventually return to haunt us. This is a reality we have to face. So the key lines of convergence between secular and religious approaches to the ecological task include those principles expressed in the Earth Charter, as referred to in Laudato Si itself, stressing the need for a new reverence for life, a firm resolve to achieve sustainability, the quickening of the struggle for justice and peace, and the joyful celebration of life. Now, the declaration submitted at COP21 or made since by the leaders and bodies of major religions are all largely consistent with this and with the key integral ecological principles of interconnectedness and interdependence. Now, it is hoped that the divergences which remain will not prevent further dialogue, and transdisciplinary collaboration in the interests of the common good and the future of the planet. Nobody and nothing in creation shall be treated under respect. That's the principle. Nothing to be treated shall be treated with under respect. All nature must be treated with integral respect. Now, that's the term I've taken from the statute. Integral respect. That is, with respect that accords with the integrity of each and everything in its proper place in creation. I would call that the integral respect principle. And no human being must ever be used as mere means to an end. All human beings, by reason of their nature, must be respected as persons of equal intrinsic worth and dignity, and must also be treated with benevolence and care, beloved. That is the personalist principle. The first part of it is Kantian, but the second part of it is added, that is, that human beings must also be loved. Now, these are the three principles. I hope that the key lines of convergence will then actually dispose of, in fact, resolve of the problems about the biocentrism and ecocentrism and so on. Under respect, with integral respect, with equal intrinsic worth and dignity. Now, in conclusion, the fate of humankind is inseparable from the fate of planet Earth. If planet Earth itself has become a patient, there can be no lasting healing of either the wounded planet or us, unless it is healed together with us who dwell thereon, through bonding with and tender care of our common home. The fate of humankind is inseparable from the fate of the earth. Healthcare is earth care, and that's taken from Hank, the book, Wounded Planet. We need to heal as one, together with our planet. No one is saved alone. We can only be saved together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hank and Dennis, for your presentations. A lot of things are being raised and mentioned in these two talks. The audience may have some questions to you. Also, there's already one question raised in the chat from Dr. Kishore to Hank. So can we change the view so that we can look at the faces? And maybe Hank, can you answer the question? I'm not sure Dr. Kishore wants to pose that question again in person, or do you want to just read it from the chat? Dr. Kishore?
Yeah. My question is from Professor Hank and Health.
Right.
What I understood from your presentation, you perceive that everything in nature is divine and everything is worthy of respect. It's not only the Homo sapiens.
Okay.
Now, in one of the holy books, Bhagavad Gita, Lord Krishna says, I have quoted in Sanskrit, but I'll read the English translation. The Lord says to Arjun, the conqueror, I am the super consciousness that resides in all living beings. I am the beginning, the middle, and end of all creatures. So how do you respond to this? How do you respond to Indian thought that everything in the nature is crystallization of same cosmic consciousness as enshrined in Holy Gita?
Yeah, thank you very much, because your question also refers, I think, to the idea that in many religions and religious perspectives, the connectedness of human beings has been emphasized. What I find a kind of interesting comparison with this idea of cosmic consciousness is the emergence in more modern times of global consciousness, regardless of the religious perspectives that people have. One of the photos shown by Dr. Zhang was the picture of planet Earth from outer space, the so-called blue marbles, in the 60s with the Apollo spacecraft mission. And that is generally regarded as a important symbol to change the thinking of many people, that they became aware that they share a similar destiny on a planet that is very fragile and vulnerable. So it is argued that this was really a kind of impetus to the emergence of global consciousness, that people share the same kind of fate and destiny, which could be a more secular, I would say, version than the idea of a cosmic consciousness from a religious point of view. And I think that subsequent events like climate change, the pandemic, has also reiterated that same global consciousness. And if you talk to young people, they are very much aware that their existence is intimately connected with that of people elsewhere. The main problem is, and that's I think the ethical challenge, is that regardless of this growing global consciousness, the practical consequences are rather limited. Because if you look at the recent pandemic, everybody was aware that this is a global phenomenon, that if we want to address the phenomenon, we need global international action. We need vaccines that are equally distributed across the globe. But the usual response was to focus only on your national citizens. And there was very much talk about solidarity, but not much action in that area. And I think that's the challenge for the ethical debate in the near future. How can we, so to speak, capitalize on the global consciousness that people have?
Thank you.
Okay, there's a question from Suma Lee.
Hello, can you hear me? Hello? Okay, my question is short. If my question is silly, I apologize, because I start to be confused right now. Because if everything is interrelated, are we still capable to speak about anything having intrinsic value? What does it mean by the term intrinsic value in ecolocentrism? Because as I understand, intrinsic means essential. If we are interrelated, it means we can be changed, and we are changing all the time. So what does it mean, intrinsic value? Thank you very much.
Is that directed to both speakers or to the second speaker? Who is it?
The second speaker.
Second speaker, Dennis. Did you hear that question?
No, I hear half of it. Can you sort of?
So she was saying that if everything is interrelated,
Yes.
what does it mean to have intrinsic value? Because they all seem to have the same value.
Well, intrinsic value doesn't mean the same value. That's the point. I mean, if you accord the same value to, say, a cancer cell vis-a-vis the human being, I mean, so you can't say that your intrinsic value must be the same value. So what is important is to accord everything with, well, it has got intrinsic value, but you should not sort of accord them with under respect, as you were, not less value than it has. But at the same time, you need to the term used is integral value, which means to say which respect the integrity of the living thing or the non-living thing, respect in its proper place. And so, but when it comes to human beings, the personalist principle would be that they should be human beings have equal intrinsic value. equal intrinsic value, but otherwise you will be discriminating between one human being and another human being. So the presence of intrinsic value does not mean that it is equal.
Is that okay, Sumali? Did that answer your question?
Because if everything is interrelated, in my understanding, we are changing all the time. Can we have intrinsic value, really have intrinsic value, or essential value?
I think interrelated doesn't mean the same. It doesn't mean that we are all the same. So if we are not the same, then the fact that we're interrelated does not answer the question as to whether there should be equal intrinsic value or maybe there's a hierarchy of values. But otherwise, you end up, that if we are regarded as on the same moral sort of level status as anything else, as a virus, well, if it's so easy for those in power to say that, well, I could eliminate you too, because I regard you, as no more important than the virus. And maybe it's overpopulation or maybe whatever, using methods which are unethical and say that I'm going to eliminate that because your value is no higher than anything else.
Okay, Noor has a question, and then John has a question. Noor?
Hello.
Hello.
So I have a short question to Professor Hein. I would just like to know more about Professor Hein's idea on global bioethics. Why is it important, and then are we global enough today? Yeah. Thank you.
Hank, did you hear that question? Do you understand that? Hank?
Yeah, the sound was very far away, so I didn't hear the question, actually.
Basically, she was asking about what is global bioethics and are we global enough today? Is that right? Well, that's okay.
Well, I would argue that global bioethics is a kind of broad approach to ethical issues that focuses not only on the individual person, but also the social context and the ecological context. So if you must be aware that many of the diseases are related. Of course, they are manifested in individual persons, but they are often related to the social conditions in which the person is living. If you have no reliable water, if you have insufficient food, then your health will be seriously impacted. So in the bioethical debate, you cannot simply focus on how illnesses are manifested in individuals, but you have to have a broader view on how the whole context in which individuals are living is promoting and reinforcing diseases. I think, are we global enough? I think no, because if you look at our recent experiences with the pandemic, the focus in the pandemic was very much on clinical approaches, on intensive care units, and there was not much attention to preventive issues, on conditions in which the virus has emerged. While we know that the most effective way to deal with the pandemic is actually to change our social behavior. So individuals should be convinced that through their individual behavior, they contribute to the benefit of all. And that was the prime message in most countries. While at the same time, there was a frantic search for medication, vaccines, and all kinds of other issues, as if there could be a kind of magic bullet to deal with the pandemic. So I think that if you look at WHO as a representative organization for the global community, they took a lot of initiatives. They started international trial, they set up solidarity mechanisms, they created COVAX for pooling vaccines, but the effect was very slow. In many countries, they have nice promises, but they don't really invest it in these common approaches. And I think that's what I meant in the earlier question, that we have this global consciousness, but it hardly results, or too little results, in practical steps to implement it.
Can we, there's a question from online from, they haven't spoken yet. So Edmund and then John, is that okay, John? You to the question, yes. Edmund, can
yes.
you, yes.
Yes, thank you very much. Deeply appreciate the insights of the two keynote speakers. Certainly opening up a lot of discussion that we can continue, especially providing a framework for our whole workshop. There's things that we can go deeper, but I guess because of the limit of time, and we may have opportunities tomorrow to go through it. I have just one or two or three quick comments. I find Hank brought up a very important point about traditional knowledge, which is closely related to what Dennis tried to bring up, the relational self, the Confucian concept and values. I think this is one of the perspectives when we can look into. But the fact that if you look at the history of these the last 50 years, where we're still under this kind of if I may use Edward Said's concept of Orientalism, the kind of discrimination or looking down upon traditional knowledge or Asian knowledge in particular, that this kind of mentality is still, to me, rather forceful. So in terms of intercultural and interfaith dialogues, so much have to be done, especially when Hank talk about education, environmental education or ecological education. I think it goes back to the fundamental theme of the workshop, that we have to look at ecological issues, from an intercultural and interreligious perspective. I think this is one point that can be linked up to the second point. How about the global environment, in the present day, especially this kind of tribalism, this kind of conflict mentality in the world in the last 10 and 20 years. So we're looking, in fact, a global situation of crisis. So I think that's the second point. One last point that I would like to bring up, especially with relation to the very macro framework that Dennis has provided, which is very useful. But a point about language and words being used, because when we use the concept or the term integral for standard interpretation or explanation or definition, is about integrity, related to integrity, or related to the whole, the integral part of the whole. But if you look at another dimension that Dennis would like to bring up through the Laudato Si, is the spiritual dimension, or we call cultural dimension, especially when Heidegger was brought into the picture, because in fact Heidegger was talking about something else. There's this kind of hermeneutic phenomenology to look at how the what we call the actor and the context are closely interconnected. So I think the term integral has to be looked into more closely, from a broader or especially from an intercultural perspective. So these are some short comments and questions.
Thank you, Edmund. And we saw Christina also appearing, disappearing. Anyway, your comments are mostly directed to Dennis. Are there any response or from Dennis or?
I'm looking forward to.
For Hank too, because the global situation is more related to.
Okay. Okay. Also to Hank. Any comments by Hank or Dennis?
No.
No. Okay.
I think that
Yeah, okay.
I think that Edmonds he signaled two fundamental problems. One regarding traditional knowledge, and he's right. It's not sufficiently respected. At the same time, we know that for many people in many countries, this is the ordinary healthcare provision. That they don't go to Western medicine. They have traditional healers that they appeal to, and that is still important in many countries. We, on the other hand, also see that in developed countries, more and more people are not happy with the traditional, with the way medicine is commonly operating, and they have their own traditional systems or alternative medicine. So it's still a very important issue. The second question you noticed, and you're completely right, the global approach is nowadays seriously in danger, because there are so many criticisms of globalization by populist parties that there seems to be, and the war and the pandemic was illustration, a return to national responses. At the same time, I think that many people, they have a more subtle view than the populist approach, because they know that globalization has brought many benefits. They all, even the populists, they're criticizing globalization with their smartphones and with internet. So it is, I think, mainly the economic disadvantages and the inequalities that have been associated with globalization that has created problems. And what we see nowadays is a redefinition of neoliberal policies, market thinking, because as a result of the pandemic. So I'm not so concerned that this will be a longer term trend, because people will also see the benefits of having a global approach.
Okay, John, and then we go down the break. Yes.
So, can you hear me? This is directed towards Dennis. You began your comment on what I see, speaking of the need for a central need for an anthropology, and you developed some more of the ideas in the book's work. And at some point, you referenced Kant's ethics, and then a little bit later, you referred to John Finnis. And both Kant and Finnis propose or imply anthropology. And in their anthropologies, reason is central. The capacity to know the other must be mediated through reason. And Finnis, although he's a neo-Aristotelian, he's a Thomistic Aristotelian. And for Finnis, you must use reason to develop his basic values or the several characteristics he proposes to be central, the central importance of human life. Now, I read Laudato Si and the Pope's project to be somewhat different, because it seems that the Pope is more in the Franciscan mind rather than the Dominican mind, which the Dominicans seem to put reason as very important, and the Franciscan mind, and it seems the Pope suggest this or emphasizes this in Laudato Si is the capacity to directly engage the other, not mediated through reason. Because that's what compassion is. Compassion is not something mediated through reason. And so Kant and Finis as kind of anchors or authorities for the, anyway, it's a question, why Kant and Finis and not who require reason to know the other, and not some other anthropologist or that is anthropological philosophers or philosophies in which direct knowledge of the other, for instance, Aristotle or Hegel, is a possibility. Because in Kant and Finis, it's not even a possibility, or it's a remote possibility.
Dennis, did you understand the question?
I didn't hear all of it, but I thought the question is about reason, right? About reason. Why are you using reason? Is that enough? Could you sort of repeat the question?
So the question was that it seems like, according to John, that Laudato Si seems to use the more Franciscan method, which is a direct, unmediated contact, rather than the Dominican reason-based anthropology, which you seem to appeal to using Kant and Finis, which has an emphasis on reason, instead of Franciscan, which is more a direct mediation.
Yes, I understand that. But I think we have to remember that we're dealing with embodied reason. I mean, we are embodied creatures, so we are using reason, not simply in the sense of an abstract intellectual, but in the sense that you're using the whole person. It's not judgment, a rational, but affective judgment. So it will be the whole person who will be engaged in making the judgment. So you work from data, you work from consciousness, you go to concept, and then you still have to make your judgment. And when you do so, you're not restricted to a certain type of reason. You are an embodied. It is embodied cognition. So it is embedded reason. It is reason. It involves the whole person, the whole feeling, thinking, acting person. That is the meaning of reason. It's not simply reason in the sense of disembodied. I wonder whether that is at least one sort of way of at least partly answer your question. Yeah.
Well, I understand that.
Yes.
I mean, that sounds helpful, but I mean, having read Finis and read at least enough of Kant to kind of get a sense of that, it seems like what you're referring to is embodied reason more as more of a sense of prudence, Aristotelian prudence or something, which then shifts the conversation away from reason into some kind of different consideration. But to me, the key thing is that if one must reason to the other, then there's an interference with the direct capacity to have compassion, because compassion is a direct experience versus an experience that has to be moderated really anyway by reason, or what we call reason. I mean, reason has to have meaning. I mean, you can change the meaning of reason by saying it's an embodied thing, but then maybe are you still talking about something we can refer to as reason or something else, because reason would be the organizing principle of the entire package of perceptions that is being acted on. In other words, if you say there's reason and it's embodied even, you still have the guiding principle of reason, which is the issue.
Yes, I understand what you're saying. Sometimes the going to the heart knows reasons that the head does not. So when you are using the whole person, the feeling, acting, thinking, person. You are thinking not just with your head. You're also thinking with your heart, because the heart can know reasons that the head does not. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, thanks. Anyway, I really enjoyed your
Yes,
presentation.
thank you.
I hope you finish what. Get a copy.
Okay, we'll wait for the 2 articles. Will be included in the package and hopefully in the book. Now we have a break for half an hour. We come back at, let's say, 4:30 because that's our original time. So a little bit shorter break. And thank you once again, Dennis and Hank, for your wonderful exposition today. It's given us a lot of thoughts, food for thought. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. Thank you to the organizers. Thank you to everyone. I'll jump right into it because I can be rather verbose as a person. I will be presenting on the Orthodox Christian perspective on ecological ethics. I won't spend too much time here on my first slide. There's overlap with discussions we had earlier, but I'd be remiss if I didn't bring this up. Within the Orthodox tradition, nature, or physis, ktesis, and I'll hash those out a bit later, is understood as both good and beautiful. We heard this in our earlier discussion on the Islam panel, when there was a conversation between Judaism and Islam. Within Genesis, God creates the natural world, and all natural entities, plants, animals, the earth, are the first things ever described as good. In the Greek Septuagint, this is the word kalon. In Hebrew, this is the word taub. Sorry about my pronunciation. Right? Both words translate well into one another because they both mean good and beautiful simultaneously. So there's this idea that everything is good and everything is beautiful at once. And this is reiterated again in the New Testament, that everything, natural creation, is good. The Orthodox perspective, like other Christian perspectives and other Abrahamic faiths, adopts a stewardship interpretation, not a domination interpretation of the Genesis story, so that humans have dominion over the earth in Genesis, yet must cultivate and keep it. The idea of dominion here, right, entails responsibility for. Even in the original Hebrew, radah, which means reign over, which some people interpret harshly. If you read even in Ezekiel, there's a criticism of shepherds in Ezekiel, when they're being ruled over, radah is the word used, harshly. So there's this idea that you have a responsibility for. Dominion as dominus, right? We already heard that ikos means home, and this idea of tending to, caring for, being responsible for. So that within the Orthodox point of view, humans are given a task, and this task is stewardship. And we'll see that it goes even beyond that, that part of this caring for creation is to partake in God's creative work of the renewal of life. This will make more sense once I explain the Trinitarian theology. So to be responsible for the well-being of nature and to cultivate life. I'll expand upon this idea of cultivation later on. And in order to understand a more robust interpretation of the concept of cultivation, we have to look at especially the Greek Orthodox understanding of the Trinity. In the Greek Orthodox tradition, God is believed to be a living and triune divinity. In Greek, the terms ousia, essence, and hypostasis are used. So God is a singular essence with 3 hypostasis. This gets translated into persona in the Latin, which I find to be an inaccurate translation. A hypostasis is a unique manifestation, so to speak. It is something that it's not quite a person, right? It is the way something becomes manifest in a particularity, in a uniqueness. So these are 3 hypostasis, manifestations, expressions of the divinity. The divinity expresses itself and in this creative moment, the origination of everything in the cosmic order. And this is pater pandokratoras, the pandokrator, that which holds everything within itself and is the cause of everything. This is the origin, the basis of existence, the foundation of being in and of itself. Then there's the second hypostasis of the divinity, which is the logos. The logos is word or reason, message, meaning. It's also the ordering principle of everything in the universe. This Greek term, which begins with Heraclitus and goes through the Stoics, is picked up in early Christianity for this purpose. When John's gospel says that everything is created through the word, it's the term logos that is used. Again, reducing logos to either reason, or ratio in the Latin, or word in English, does it in injustice, because it misses the idea that there's this ordering cosmic principle that the term logos itself refers to. So this is chock full of meaning. It's meaning of existence, the purpose of each being in relation to all other beings, that which guides the creation of life itself and orders living organismic systems. Maximus, Confessor, a doctor of the Catholic Church and an esteemed figure in Greek Orthodoxy, speaks of the logoi of creation, so that the logos is many different logoi permeating everything in existence. To this extent, the logos is not limited, small l logos or small lambda logos, is not limited to simply the human person, nor the human mind. Every species and every abiotic existent in the universe also has its logos, its meaning, its purpose, its internal structuring order to it, all of which are connected to the cosmic logos. This is the way in which we interpret the Christ. The cosmic Christ is this logos that is incarnate. So once you understand logos logoi, this is part of the incarnation of the divinity in the world. The logos is never present without the ayapneuma, the hyapneuma, or the Holy Spirit. I hate the interpretation of pneuma as ghost. I really don't like Holy Ghost, because we think about Oogie Boogie Casper the Ghost. Pneuma means breath. It means wind. It means many of these sorts of things in the ancient Greek. And the Hippocratic medical tradition used the term pneuma for breath. The Stoics had a deep understanding of the cosmic pneuma, which was divine in and of itself in many ways. So an accurate translation of the ayapneuma is divine spirit or holy breath. Even at the moment of Pentecost in the Christian scripture in the New Testament, when the Holy Spirit is released onto the disciples, Jesus the Christ breathes on them, right? And the term used is pneuma. This is used to convey many things, but the idea of spirit is this universal presence of divine energies permeating all that has been created and is found in the dynamic living systems. It is the dynamic, life-sustaining, vital force of all existence, and that which brings about, together with the logos, and sustains the existence of even abiotic beings, so to speak. Orthodoxy is a form of panentheism. Panentheos is different from pantheism. Pan, all-encompassing, and within, and theos, divinity. The divine is within all existence, but not everything is divine. Right? So it's not pantheism, the idea that everything is God. It's the idea that the divine, and as we see, once we understand logos in this sense and pneuma in this sense, and we can see how these energies and principles can be found permeating all of the natural world. This leads to a belief in the idea that creation is itself sanctified because there is divine energies and divine logi permeating it. This also not only extends logos beyond the human, but extends sanctity of life beyond human life in the Orthodox Christian tradition. So to misuse or to harm the natural world is to directly disrespect God. As John Chrysavies, the advisor to Patriarch Bartholomew, the ecumenical patriarch in Orthodoxy and the head of the Greek Orthodox Church, has said, we can see the face of God in the face of nature. And we can think about this as to harm the face of nature is to spit on the face of the Lord. I am verbose. So the Trinity is relational, right? And let me keep going here much quicker, right? To be unique and irreplaceable is what it means to have this sort of sanctity in the natural world. And this is an important point because it gets into the social ethics part. The theologian John Ziziolas has said, the sanctification of creation means that each and all capital L life has a uniqueness and an irreplaceability. We'll see in a moment how that relates to the idea of ecological sin. Since 1989, the Orthodox Church has celebrated the Day of Care for Creation on 1st of September. And this is the month of the Care for Creation, which Pope Francis adopted for the Catholic Church in 2015 and quotes Patriarch Bartholomew in Laudato Si. In 1997, Bartholomew coined the term ecological sin. I won't read the quote that I have up, but it means to cause harm to nature is itself a sin. To sin is to miss the mark and not to break a law in the Greek tradition. Amartia means to miss your goal, to fail to attain the goal of being good, to fail to live up to our human task that we were given on that first slide, which is to partake in the renewal of life, to an extent to engage in regenerative work of bringing forth continual life. So it is a regenerative idea of cultivation, a regenerative idea of development, and a regenerative idea of growth. Physis, or nature in Greek, means to grow, but we've reduced that idea to simply increase rather than regeneration. This also implies that we have collectively failed to do this as humanity, right? Humans have a task as a species here. And this is where Bartholomew says that the ecological crisis is a more general moral crisis. And the root cause of this environmental sin is our mistaken order of values and our self-centeredness that has caused us to miss the mark, so to speak. What are some of these mistaken values? We've heard some of this already today, that our anthropocentrism on a collective level leads to our environmental destruction. We have only human-centered values. And as we see, if the logos and pneuma are everywhere, and not just within us, we cannot have a humans-only value system. We need to stop looking at nature as only being instrumentally valuable. And we must stop viewing nature as something that needs to be subjugated, tamed, or controlled. This speaks to the idea of dominion as responsibility for. This also means that we can't look at ourselves as atomistic, right? We are a world comprised not of independent, stratified beings, but interdependent beings that share this logos and pneuma for our own vitality. And the last mistaken value is this idea of progress, the myth of progress. Not that there can't be improvement or that we can't progress, nor that science and technology are bad. But the myth part is that science and technology can only improve human life and civilization. An idea of linear moral development where we can only get morally better and never lapse backwards. That is a myth. We can lapse backwards, right? Science and technology can be misused. Bear with me as I go through the ecological vices real quick. Arrogance, avarice, gluttony, and apathy are the four cardinal vices within the Christian tradition. And our arrogance on a collective level has been our anthropocentrism. Not only have we only been concerned for humanity, but generationally in recent decades and the past 100 or 200 years, we've had disregard for future generations as we make our decisions. We've been avaricious. We've greedily pursued wealth and power at the expense of regeneration, health, and well-being of human and non-human communities. We've been gluttonous. We engage in excessive consumption and excessive production of food, natural resources, material goods. We engage in overproduction and overconsumption due to our misunderstanding of prosperity as abundance rather than prosperity as flourishing. And that's directly related to cultivation as development, and development as increase instead of development as regeneration. And apathy. We often fall into indifference toward our social and ecological injustices. And if we don't become indifferent, we neglect them or brush them aside. We push the responsibility onto other people, other entities, the state, past generations. Can't do anything now. It's too difficult. Our apathy and laziness get the better of us and help create and perpetuate our environmental sin, so to speak. And I'll just end on this slide because I'd like to not overlook this. The uniqueness and irreplaceability that we saw, that the Orthodox tradition views life through that prism, unique and irreplaceable, is directly at odds with commodification. To commodify life is a denial of its sanctity. To be unique and irreplaceable is the antithesis of commodity, because a commodity is inherently fungible. It can be exchanged in the market for any other entity or product of equal value. So we can return to this slide during the discussion after Vardit comes to give her commentary. And I'll just end with Bartholomew's call for metanoia, repentance. And repentance isn't just saying, I'm sorry. It entails a fervent change of mindset and a radical transformation of our lifestyles. It entails a self-transfiguration as well as a societal transfiguration on a global level. So we need a correct lifestyle, a right livelihood, to use Buddhist terminology, which vibes very well with the Greek Orthodox position, in order to enact the types of changes we need to repent for our ecological sins. Thank you very much.
I titled my response to Chris, Bioethics and Environmental Ethics, a Historical Perspective on a Missed Opportunity. So I would like to approach your key argument, one of your key arguments, from a secular perspective. And I'll start by summarizing from the written paper two elements that I saw. And I think your presentation now was much richer, of course, than what I'm going to capture, but this is just as a starting point for my response. So the Orthodox Christian tradition's view of the protection of the environment is an ethical and spiritual imperative. And I think you talked in great detail in a very rich way about the theological underpinnings, the view of the regenerative and symbiotic nature of ecosystems as brought forth by divine creative energies. And then you moved from that on to humanity's moral responsibility to serve as stewards and caretakers of the biosphere and biodiversity. But I want to focus on the last part of your presentation, your argument regarding humanity's moral failure to be those stewards and caretakers that we're supposed to be as a result of our anthropocentrism, the root cause being our self-centeredness, our pathological disposition of self-conceitedness, our collective egoism, our self-conceit as a species, not just as lazy individuals, our civilizational pride that we have deluded ourselves into thinking that we are all that matters, that we do not coexist with and depend upon other life forms. So these are all taken straight out of your written paper, and I felt very attacked by all of this because our moral failure is wide and deep. And of course, I had the impulse of defending us. However, it's late in the day and we have been sitting for a long time. So you guys are probably hoping for, war right now. You want me to fight back. However, I don't want to disappoint you, but I come in peace, Chris. I come in peace because on your last point, I'm going to actually embrace and accept your key argument from a secular perspective, and especially looking at it from the perspective of the birth and evolution of bioethics as a relatively young field of study and practice. So I want to offer two insights in response. The first is the missed opportunity embedded in the origins of bioethics because of the failure of the Potterian view that we already mentioned during the keynotes. But not to end on a depressive note, I want to end with a reason for optimism and note recent developments in bioethics, specifically the emergence in the last 20 years of public health ethics, and more recently, an increased focus on global justice. And I want to note what these two developments might mean for the future of the relationship between bioethics and environmental ethics. So we saw Potter here today, and it's not surprising that he's a key figure in this workshop because his vision is so relevant and important to the discussions we're having. So as a reminder, Potter, who coined the term bioethics in the early 70s, saw bioethics as an interplay of ecology, medicine, and human values. He was hoping for a space for the study and the discussion of the relationship between natural ecosystem, their impact on health, and the future of humanity. He was hoping that this would enable humanity to live in harmony with the biosphere, protect the environment, and preserve non-human biological systems. So when we think about what bioethics was in its early days, we can see the great gap between this vision and the young field. And it's also very telling that in parallel to bioethics, a different field of applied ethics has developed, namely environmental ethics. These two fields have their own terminologies, areas of study, journals, conferences, and they have not been talking to each other for decades. And I want to present this as the tragedy of bioethics. So in light of Potter's failure to shape bioethics discourse, who was the winner? I call it the Georgetown view because, of course, it was captured by the famous Georgetown mantra and the notion that there are principles that need to focus the attention of bioethics on certain conceptual tools and certain topics. And I call this narrow focused view, well, I put a question mark, but I'm actually going to argue that it was myopic to focus us on a biomedical scope. Why did this happen? So historically, obviously, we need to remember that the birth of bioethics occurred at a time that we felt we need an urgent focus on protecting individuals from systemic abuse. So, the Nuremberg Code was also mentioned, scandals and abuses in research, traditional medical paternalism in light of the emergence of human rights, etc. this is not going to be a presentation on the history of the 50s and the 60s, but we all know that bioethics emerged in response to certain events that focused our attention on individuals. It was also a response to challenges raised by biotechnological innovations that again focused on what medicine can do for the individual. But I want to add another element or aspect to this that is less usually mentioned, and that is the fact that around that time, advances in microbiology fostered an externalization of the causes of disease, and that endorsed a perception of the environment, anything outside our body, as posing a threat, as a risk to our individual health, rather than the environment as a possible source of individual well-being and survival. So even at the scientific level, we were encouraged to see ourselves as sort of these atomic, not just bioethically, our autonomy had to be protected conceptually, but even physiologically, we had as individuals to protect ourselves from the invasion coming from the environment. So these are just a very high level reasons, not justifications, but reasons for the fact that bioethics developed the way it did. My argument is that this was a missed opportunity to develop this young field from an inclusive perspective that would have been able to account more comprehensively for the plurality of issues associated with human health. So Chris, again, I am not going to deny any of your claims about our guilt and our fault. I'm just going to present them from a different perspective. This failure of the Potterian vision, I'd like to argue, entailed a delay of decades in addressing critical aspects of human flourishing. And it would have allowed bioethics to address the various challenges facing human health and well-being in a way that sees humans as an integral element of the biosphere, as you suggested through the Orthodox Christian tradition. So in a way, my bottom line is this: if bioethics had the foresight to make the wise and insightful choice, it's always easy to know what was the right thing looking back, right? So easy for me. If it had the foresight to make the wise and insightful choice of following the Potterian vision back in the 60s, it would have not only escaped your scathing critique, but could have also contributed to decades, during decades, unique perspectives to the emerging field of environmental ethics. This could have helped focus the attention of political decision makers, which Alberta is worried about, on the implications of environmental concerns for human health and disease as they were emerging prior to the climate change crisis. So when I look at this missed opportunity, I really feel it as a tragedy of what a more robust conversation between these fields could have contributed, even at the political level, and in terms of using the threat to human health as a powerful tool, weapon, to bring attention to the environment earlier on. But to end with an optimistic tone, I think there are two reasons to be optimistic, and these are recent development in bioethics, as I noted. The first is the fact that over the last 20 plus years, finally, we started being more aware of the ethical dimensions of public health. Obviously, the tension between protecting the individual and public health concerns that call us to put the common good, to prioritize the common good, this tension is ongoing, and it was never more present than during the last 2.5 years, when we were told to stay home, not see our loved ones, make sacrifices every day at every level in order to protect the common good. And I think for a lot of us, this was very counterintuitive, because we didn't, we were not used to thinking about health in those terms. So it was a big, really increased the awareness of what public health means and what demands it can make on us. There is now a journal called Public Health Ethics. There's an increasing volume of literature. There are conceptual frameworks that have been developed with lists of principles. And I can tell you that in Canada, I was very much present in the media during the pandemic, actually to translate these concepts and these principles to the public as a way to support the government's public health measures by explaining why this is the right balance between sacrificing your individual interests and protecting the common good, and how each measure, in Canada, we had curfew. Obviously, like everywhere else, schools were closed. People couldn't visit loved ones in the hospital, even on their deathbed. We lived very tragic situations, and it was an opportunity for bioethics to be present in the public sphere and explain how all these conceptual tools of public health ethics now really play a role in justifying political decision-making and the management of the pandemic. So the pandemic, these concepts really show how you cannot divorce the individual from its environment, whether it's communities or the threats that the environment can pose. The second reason for optimism is the increased attention to global justice. In my written paper, I talk about how even though justice is one of the 4 principles, and even though we have been in bioethics talking about justice, it was usually micro resource allocation on the individual level. And it looked less at systemic issues of allocation and even less on the global scene. And today, in mainstream bioethics conferences, we see issues such as the rights of migrant workers, issues of allocation across borders. And of course, this came this got increased attention regarding the debate on vaccine nationalism and global vaccine inequity, where bioethicists have really contributed a lot to the international and governments, the WHO development of guidelines and local governments thinking about how much they owe of rich countries, how much they owe ethically to other countries with less resources. My claim is that this increased attention to global justice in general opens the door to environmental concerns, because as the climate crisis is increasing, we will see more and more health impacts of fires, floods, people being forced to migrate to other parts of the world where they can survive. The health implications of all this will require a discussion of global justice that bioethics is finally starting to develop the conceptual tools for. So my conclusion is this: the young secular field of bioethics historically missed an opportunity to frame its discourse appropriately. By that, I mean inclusively. Chris's critique is sadly justified, even from a secular perspective. Bioethics anthropocentrism was indeed myopic. Bioethics is belatedly catching up by developing research areas and conceptual tools to address environmental threats to public health. The emerging interest in global justice also opens the door to environmental awareness, and the pandemic was a painful wake-up call that will hopefully set bioethics even further on a path towards an inclusive vision. And as I say thank you for listening, some of you remembered that in Casablanca on my thank you slide, I had a picture of one of my children. So in line with our topic this time, I would like to share with you the recent addition to our family. We're not that anthropocentric. So this is Mila, who brought us a lot of joy during the pandemic, and I thank you for your attention.
To do that. Here's a joke about that Protestants tell. What does it mean when a pastor looks at his watch? And the answer is nothing. So, sorry, that's the whole joke. We're a long-winded people. Okay, sorry. So social psychologists have observed that people on the outside of groups view those on the inside monolithically. Christians fail to see the diversity within Judaism. Buddhists miss the variety in Islam, and so on. So I recognize that all of our traditions appear diverse, divided from the inside. But that said, Protestantism really is a mess. It is not a single tradition, it's not a single church. The word Protestant just means churches in Western Christianity that are not Catholic. And this not Catholicness is not an effective organizing principle. Many Protestant denominations are small, and a great many Protestant churches are entirely independent, with no higher organization beyond the local congregation, no leader beyond the local pastor. This lack of central organization to Protestantism stunts its environmental conscience, in my opinion, because small local churches are swayed by local interests and political currents and are not accountable to members in other parts of the world. They are thus on average less environmentally minded than Catholics, but they're also more extreme. Protestants range from radical ecocentrists holding services where they confess sins to plants to rabid deniers of all environmental responsibility, and everything in between. So that's my first point. Our divisions have stunted our environmental conscience. The second point is that despite this diversity, those Protestants who are environmentalists have shown a remarkably homogeneous form of thought. The field of Christian environmental ethics has been dominated by a felt need to respond to the criticism of Lynn White Jr., his article in 1967, The Historical Roots of the Ecologic Crisis. So even while debating or rejecting his conclusion that Christianity is inherently anti-environmental, they've accepted his premise that, quote, what we do about our ecology depends on religion. For example, the Lutheran environmental ethicist Larry Rasmussen has written that our outer ecologies, what we actually do, reflect our inner ecologies, the way we imagine our relationship to nature. There has been a general acceptance of the idea that religious beliefs dictate environmental outcomes, and that a conscious, intentional effort to change religious belief is a powerful part of an urgent activist reform project. The field does not aim to inculcate non-anthropocentric forms of belief because they believe these are right and true. They aim to spread these ideas in order to save the earth. In fact, the saving of the earth is often given priority and used as a warrant for the proposed change. We should adopt belief X, not on the grounds that this belief is true, but on the grounds that it will work. The author may believe it is true, but that is almost beside the point in the way it's presented. Lynn White called on Christianity to change its beliefs to save the world, and that is what many Protestant thinkers have aimed to do. The problem is anthropocentrism, they say, so they offer non-anthropocentrism. The problem is dualism, so they suggest holism. The problem is dominion thinking, so they argue for stewardship. Because the problem is in the cognitive content of thought, in offering new cognitive content, new religious beliefs, they believe they are offering solutions to the fundamental causes of environmental problems. Religion is not a form of life, a set of rituals, or a way of making meaningful sense of the world, according to this approach. Religion is a set of beliefs that make people do things. So we should change beliefs to make people do different, better things. That's the approach. Okay. So I argue in the paper that this adoption of White's framework has been a mistake. His argument, as originally given, is a mess, unsupported by empirical evidence, and rests on an argument about the influence of Christianity that is implausible at best and Eurocentric, if not racist, at worst. White is often read as saying that Christianity makes Christians bad environmental citizens by making them anthropocentric in their values. What he actually says is that Christianity is to blame for the crisis because it forms the imaginative basis of the modern marriage of science and technology. He says that all significant science today is intrinsically Western and thus Christian at its core. He says, no matter your race or nationality, if you're doing significant science, you're to that extent Western, and Occidental is the word he uses. Where was I? It is for this reason that fixing Christian theology, according to White, can change our planetary environmental trajectory. He thinks the entire complex of our global industrialized technological civilization rests on what he calls Christian axioms, a foundation that has to change if our environmentalist efforts are going to work. This interpretation, even while blaming Christianity for environmental collapse, credits Christianity for all modern advances in science, technology, medicine, transportation, physics, astronomy, so on. Like all of modernity is at its core, not just in its origin, but in its core, Christian. I am troubled by how remarkably similar White's argument is to what you find in Eurocentric white supremacist literature today that credits everything good in the world to Christianity, or they call it the Judeo-Christian tradition. The problem with thinking that religion directly drives environmental outcomes is not just, so the problem with thinking that religion drives outcomes is not just that Lynn White's argument is implausible and colonialist, it is also unsupported empirically. If we analyze the last 70,000 years of human history without a predisposition to see religion as a central driving force, there is little in that record to suggest religious differences are the main driver of environmental outcomes. The most important difference here is not between religions and cultures, but between human beings as such and other creatures. We have, as a species, shown a relentless pattern of ecological devastation, dating from the spread of humans across the globe, particularly in continents like Australia and the Americas, which did not co-evolve with hominids, or the organisms there did not co-evolve with hominids. Differences between cultures and eras are extremely significant, of course. My recognition of the universal human tendency to be ecologically dangerous is not intended to deny the real differences in the lifestyles of, say, a suburban American who owns 2 cars and flies to workshops on the other side of the world, or for instance, an indigenous person in Brazil. But I believe the differences in environmental footprint are better explained by material differences in context, the length of human habitation there, the number of domesticable animals, the type of soil, the size of the landmass, those sorts of material differences. Environmental impact is better explained by those than by differences in cognitive belief structures. And I can explain more about what I mean by that in the Q&A. So now, I don't think many Protestant environmentalists writing today honestly think, with White, that their proposed changes to religious beliefs will revolutionize the basis of global science and technology and industry and everything else. However, a great many of them continue to assume that religion has enormous power to move behavior without suggesting any more plausible or less problematic mechanism for how this works than White does. Protestants continue to insist that the cognitive content of religious beliefs is the most fundamental driver of environmental impact and is the best explanation of differences between the impact of different cultures and eras, without any evidence for this fact beyond either references to White's argument or to a vague correlation between parts of the world that are historically Christian and forms of life that are ecologically devastating. I find this disappointing, that they haven't developed a more nuanced understanding of the relation between religion and behavior. Okay, so far I've claimed first that Protestantism is a mess. Second, that environmentalist Protestants are, despite their internal variations in theological sensibilities, heavily influenced, just in general, heavily influenced by the work of Lynn White Jr. And third, I've said that his argument is also a mess, so adopting his framing was a mistake, because it implicitly credits Christianity with all modern progress and discoveries, even while blaming it for ecological collapse. So beyond White, I've said that the deep historical record does not support the idea that religious and cultural differences are decisive and predictive factors in environmental impact. I conclude the paper by suggesting that the most valuable contribution of Protestant theology to environmentalism should not be sought in its power to shape the global environment, but rather in its ability to show us why that hope is implausible. Identify a realist strain in Protestantism, prefigured in Augustine and picked up by thinkers like Martin Luther and the American theologian and social theorist Reinhold Niebuhr. I argue that this Christian realism, for some reason I can't explain, I call it Protestant realism in my paper, but it's generally known as Christian realism. I think I was trying to stick to my role here too neatly. So I argue that this Christian realism is deeply skeptical of the power of religious and moral persuasion to shift what Niebuhr calls the main facts of history. These thinkers, realist thinkers, believe that Christian theology helps us see moral ideals revealed through the life and teaching of Jesus, but that those ideals are not a viable political aim. Rather, the ideal of Jesus stands in judgment of all political achievements and shows us the need for forgiveness. We are too fundamentally shaped by social location and power differentials and a structural self-interestedness. I can talk more about that if you want later. A structural self-interestedness, to be willing to give up power and privilege voluntarily. In fact, we are often prevented even from seeing the need for such sacrifice. I explain this to my students this way. My wife does dishes often and I don't see her do them. I always know when I do the dishes. And so if I'm counting, I think I'm doing it more often than she is. And if she's counting, she thinks, even if we're doing it equally, that we both think we're doing more than the other person. So justice often looks like injustice to both parties, is the main idea there. So it doesn't have to mean that we're evil, we're just structurally, because we are a finite self, limited in our ability to empathize with other people and see justice for what it is. So the path, Niebuhr believes that no religious, educational, or moral force has ever converted enough people to significantly change power structures. The path to a relatively just world is to bring about political change via the very best possible balance of competing powers. It is only the coercive force of social and political pressure that can restrain evil and prevent anarchy. Now, religion, ethics, and education are necessary to prevent politics from becoming a vicious realm of competition between interests. It's Christian realism, not Machiavellian realism. It's not war of all against all. There are ideals we're trying to approximate in there. So religion and education are important. They can, within a pretty limited range, shift what we value, but there remains a large gap between values and actions. They can help us to some extent to value environmental goods, but they do not protect or preserve these goods directly. We regularly harm what we love. And avoiding harm to nature is particularly challenging, even for those who love it. It is only when changes in laws, institution, and infrastructure shift incentives do we have hope to restrain harm and build a relatively more just and environmentally sustainable world. So, in short, Protestant environmentalism thought it could save the world. It cannot. What it can do is help us, or at least help Protestants, to recognize the limits of religious and moral suasion and redirect activist energy toward more direct, coercive means of behavioral change. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to say thank you to all of you who are with me here and now. Thank you, the chair, the coordinator, Professor Sorat, my supervisor, and especially Professor David Barr, who wrote a good paper. I have learned many things from your paper, and including how sincere, realistic, and straightforward a Protestant could be from in your paper. And I hope that I can also be sincere, realistic, and straightforward Buddhist to all of you. Okay. I will divide my topic into 4 parts in my 15 minutes presentation. The first part will be Barr's overview on Protestantism. The second part will be the impact of White's article regarding the ecological crisis. The third part will be Barr's following hypothesis and his conclusion. The fourth part will be my own response and questions. Because I am a non-native speaker, I will speak slowly, but since the time is very short, I will speak each part just a brief summary. The first part, I have learned in Barr's paper that Christian devotees, especially Protestants, are diverse and different in groups. 2, the nature of Protestantism is decentralized. This makes it easy to be adaptable to local influences. 3, Protestant churches de-emphasize rituals, sacraments, and asceticism. But 4, Protestant theologians and environmentalists have been heavily influenced by Lindwei's article or Lindwei's ideas that religion determines ecological behaviors. So it is necessary for us to take a deep look at Wei's arguments. For somebody, I think some of us may have a chance to read this article, so I will speak just a brief. White clearly stated in his famous article, The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis, published in 1967, that human ecology is deeply conditioned by religion. In the West, the ecology is mostly and deeply conditioned by Christianity. All significant scientists and successful technologies are Western in style and method, thus developed in the metric of Christian theology. Christianity not only establishes a dualism of man and nature, but also challenges the idea that it is God's will that man can exploit nature for man's benefit and under man's rule. The next, the success of Western sciences and technologies leads to environmental destruction and crisis. All these are based on Christian axiom, as you already spoke. Christianity, thus, is the most anthropocentric religion the world has seen. Actually, I doubt this statement. The roots of our ecological crisis are largely religious, so the remedy must be essentially religious, whether we call it religion or not. The last one, the ecological crisis will be worsening until we reject Christian axioms that view the existence of nature as something to serve man. Of course, Barr did not agree with White. His following hypothesis are: Barr thinks that White's ideas are Eurocentric or racist. While White is blaming Christianity, he also accredits Christianity for all advancements and thinks that Christianity can solve this problem. 2, for Barr, or according to Barr, religion has little predictive and little explanatory value. 3, knowing various source of material facts is a far more powerful predictive indicator than knowing a religious value if we want to deal with ecological behaviors. 4, what really drives environmental history is not religion or is not religious attitudes. 5, values can do just little to explain our effects on the environment. 6, what matters more than our values, and perhaps matters most, is what politics accomplishes. 7, Barr suggests what is called Protestant realism, which emphasizes on the distortion to creation brought about by sin. He thinks that this type of realism can be a Christian contribution to environmental ethics. 8, the concept of sin has a predictive power regarding human societies. Sin is not erased by becoming a Christian, cannot be. We persist in sin, but are forgiven by God. 9, because we are sinners, I am also a sinner. The government's coercion may be imperative to prevent anarchy and to secure basic goods. The absence of the government's coercive power would lead to war and violence. Social harmonies refers to Neil Bohr, who say that social harmony requires coercion. I doubt this statement. So his conclusion is that religion in general and Christianity in particular in our case should not be the focus of environmental efforts. 2, religion is not a powerful tool for protecting the environment. 3, religion can merely help us see the needs for change at the level of politics, infrastructure, and institutions. And 4, Protestantism will not save the world, but it can help us see why it cannot, and where to focus our energy instead. Frankly speaking, as a Buddhist, I like his conclusion very much. It is sincere and humble. Next, the last part will be my response and questions. In my understanding, religion is an ambiguous term. A definition of this term always eludes consensus and is open to diverse approaches. 2, though obscure, religion is very important. Almost 6 in 10 Americans indicate that religion is very important in their life. Data from organization 2013. It is perhaps because religion can bring hope, comfort, and familiarity to adherents. 3, in viewing through Ninian's mass approach, which characterize what religion is by looking at 7 interrelated dimensions: ritual, experiential, narrative, doctrinal, ethical, institutional, and material. Many secular worldviews that point to some transcendent end or point to something invisible in the future, like nationalism, democratic ideology, or the classless society of state Marxism, or these secular worldviews can also be called religion. If so, can religion have meaning without political involvement? Can we really separate politics from religion when secularism seems no longer adequate to be the only criterion for separation? Can we better solve the ecological crisis by just considering political achievement? My hypothesis is thus that it may be useless in trying to separate religion from politics, because both terms are obscure and have been used together to strengthen the hidden power of some institutions or corporations aimed at profit or aimed at organizational advancement, but actually enfeeble, weaken, or restrict the power of individual humans. In staying with and protecting the environment, we may need greater individual and collective spiritual strength, then need more religious or political institutions. 5, in Christianity, if all humans are understood as essentially purposive and meaningful beings capable to create the world to live in, the material and other animated beings in the human environment will lose their directions and lose their values, and then they will become dead. More and more, we are concerned about our vertical connection with the divine. Less and less we may have a horizontal connection with nature. 6, But to argue that we are only natural beings may be self-deceptive. Because we want to, and we know that we can live meaningfully. In the world of atoms, we have no meaning and value. We are just a series of factual events. We make sense of the environment or make sense of nature because we can stay apart from it. So how can we keep a balance between our being as a part of nature and our being as something apart from nature? Can the concept of creation help us solve this conflict so that we will not separate ourselves and feel alienated from our environmental nature? The problem may be not at God's creation, not theodicy, not the problem of evil, but the problem may be at our own existential crisis. I like Paul Tillich's existential theology. 7, the belief that human beings are special species and that everything happens by God's will has estranged us from nature and turned us into cultural beings rather than natural beings. As cultural beings, we learn to prioritize social norms and validate the welfare of our life over the preservation of other species. What should we, and from this, it leads to the fact that in culture, man can become more and more political being. What should we say if countless Christian devotees believe that the loss of the biodiversity is under God's will, or the destruction of this planet is preordained, or global warming is beyond anybody's responsibility, and the ecological crisis is the punishment of man losing faith in God? Can a theory of stewardship be powerful enough to clear away these obstructive beliefs? I asked so many questions, especially number 7, because I think that in my culture, we also face the similar obstructive beliefs, face the same difficulty, but I will speak later if I have time. My last question: is Protestant realism and the concept of sin offered by Barr an implication that the Christian concept of creation may be insufficient to help solve our ecological crisis? Will a sinner like I am always behave in a destructive way against the environment? Can a sinner like I am can I protect the environment without governmental coercive power? Or I will protect environment, but I have to protect environment under governmental coercion all the time, because I think that nobody likes to be forced. And I do not understand what coercion means. In democratic culture, it may be unacceptable. So I do not expect to have or answer here in this conference, but I am happy to have an opportunity to ask some questions. I hope that by my asking some questions, I can do something good, even very little, to the environment. Thank you very much.
The 4 speakers, I think we should have a 5-minute break, maybe for bathroom, and then when they are settled and all that, we can Corinne, I think you could have I think the beginning part is there's some questions among you four that were posed that you might want to comment on. Like let's say maybe David might want to respond to Suma Lee, some of her comments and questions. And maybe Chris might
because
want
we're
to,
on camera.
respond to the questions posed by Badit. So, okay, you can proceed. Whether Chris or David, you want to answer the questions that were posed in the responses, or you want to kind of let the audience.
I would like to respond
Sure.
to Bharti.
Okay, sure.
Thank you, everyone. I know we're kind of switched up here. Bharti, I very much enjoyed your, she was just so close. Very much enjoyed your paper. I'm going to look at them, but I'm talking to her. It's really interesting because unbeknownst to her and her response unbeknownst to me, working on a paper on Potter's work, and putting it in dialogue with the Orthodox Christian tradition. So when she sent that paper, I was very excited because I do think there was a missed opportunity in bioethics for a big B bioethics, basically to incorporate the ecological as well as the biomedical. And one thing that I want to elaborate on is another reason other than global justice and other than public health, that I think reincorporating some of Potter's ideas can be helpful. And a point of convergence with the Orthodox faith is that Maximus Confessor, who I mentioned during my presentation, believed that by studying the natural world and engaging nature, we can learn moral wisdom from our studies of the natural world. And to that extent, he spoke about the book of nature being held up equivalent to the book of scripture. And the understanding of natural law is very different from that which developed in the West, which was highly rationalistic. You got to natural law principles through the use of rationality. For Maximus, you get to the natural law by studying regenerative principles in nature, to use modern language, to see the various modes of flourishing and various types of principles that we could derive from actually studying nature itself. Potter had a similar idea that we should actually develop our science of survival, as he called it, by looking towards the natural world. And he drew on the geneticist Waddington, who spoke about biological wisdom. And Potter was very much about deriving our ethics and our bioethics on the social level, having it informed, so to speak, by this biological wisdom. So I think that point of convergence shows that a secular thought and theological thought can converge while not being identical, which is kind of like our concept of the Trinity, right? Distinct, but not fused into one homogeneous thing. And that sort of thinking can be hopefully embraced by people of faith and people who are not theists or do not accept a divinity, but see some sort of wisdom within the natural world and allow that to inform us. Whether it's what we heard in the keynote, understanding our planetary boundaries, for instance, or many other forms of ecological wisdom that can help guide our decision-making and can be part, in my perspective, part of our transfiguration towards our repentance, right, for this destruction. So I just wanted to say that.
Thank you. Yeah, David?
I would just like to say a couple of brief things in response to someone's paper. First of all, thank you. You said my paper was good. I appreciate that. but also you summarized it very well and put it on slides, and I feel like everybody has a better sense of what I said because of what you said, and I appreciate that very much. I wanted to clarify one thing. I'm not going to answer all 7 questions right now, but I will. I thought one thing maybe could be clearer in what I said as a result of your questions, and that is the line between religion and politics is, I don't think that operative in what I'm talking about. And here's why. What I mean is the difference. I think the critical difference is between persuasion, whether it's religious and moral or educational, and something. I use the word coercive somewhat provocatively, but I mean something that exerts pressure on us to change. So to the extent that a religion is acting like a state, or acting in political ways, then it's shifting from the one to the other. So I'm more interested in, I would think a political program that just does persuasion isn't going to work in the same way that, as effectively as one that is regulatory. So I think for me, what I was trying to get at more was this difference between persuasion and something that puts force or pressure on us, as opposed to wherever they're coming from. If the religion is acting like a state and enforcing things, and the politics is acting like a religion, that's fine. It may not be fine, but not for that reason.
Okay, are there any more questions in among the panelists? Now then we can open up to the. Okay. I saw Paul first, and then David, and then Anthony. Paul.
Thank you to all 4 speakers. And I was saying about it in the break that I had the experience all the time of listening to people presenting contrary point of views and saying, yes, I agree with you, yes, I agree with you, I agree with all 4 of you. And yet, how do I arrive at that? And I think my position is that it depends. So the positions work to some extent. And I'd like to work backwards and start with Sumali and say that I like your questioning. It's a nice open approach. And I also like your skepticism towards the relationship, the separation between religion and politics. And your somewhat veiled reference to the importance of religion as being obscure but nevertheless important. And your quote of Smart's approach to the aspect of one's experience of the invisible world with emotion as the hallmark of religion. And I think the danger that we fall into in these discussions is we're relying on cognition, but forgetting the emotive element. And relation to David again, I agree with you.
Thank you.
But again, it's racist issues about politics and religion. And there is a point there that somebody was addressing, which is the urban relationship with the transcendent, which I think may have underplayed. Another big question is like, but again, it's very easy to agree politics that bioethics is an opportunity. But my question to you is that again, you rely on conceptual tools. And my question is, how does that lead to action? If this is a question about what's the emotion, what's the motivation there, when we're trying to persuade people to change their minds, but even if they change their mind, it doesn't necessarily lead to action. And with Chris, same point. I'm very sympathetic, as you know, to the notion of opinion. It works well in relation to, say, Tantra, something like Eastern. But in fact, it works by accepting that all of us divide is the norm. How does that help us? Where does that lead us towards the ecology? Is there an experiential element in Orthodox Christianity that relates into passion and takes us into action of some kind? So I see you relying again on understanding, but where's the link to protect our moral values. But how do we get from the religious metaphysical ideas towards action that will counter something in relation to dealing with people?
Can I feel this? So that's one aspect of David's article that I wanted to comment on as well. And I kind of wanted to give a little bit of pushback, right? And hopefully this will help answer Paul's question as well. We're always constrained with time on where we can go. Basic answer is yes, the Orthodox tradition definitely sees, belief as embodied. It's very experiential. And that's part of the idea that belief can't be just beliefs that, it has to be beliefs in, right, to motivate. So a not non-cognitivist, but not reduce belief solely to a cognitive construct, right? And on that level, I think religion and the types of beliefs we have, if we don't just see them as conceptual constructs, as this sort of cognitive architecture, but if belief is faith, like faith in a person, faith in an ideal, in that sense, faith traditions, right? And I prefer that much more than religion, right? What you have faith in can really bring one to environmental action. Religious faith has brought people into the streets to fight social injustice, to get martyred, right? You don't usually see philosophers in the streets, right? Right. So the idea of faith traditions, right? Believing passionately about belief in, right? So this idea that if you believe in the sacrality of the natural world, right, you will be compelled to protect it, and you will refrain, not in a rationalistic way, like I shouldn't pollute this because it's bad, in a rationalistic way. But if you see the face of God in the face of nature, and you truly do believe in God, right? Or if you're not a believer, if you see intrinsic value in nature, right, you truly believe in it, I feel that will, an inherent restraint will emerge, will swell up within you, that you will not want to destroy it. You will not want to hurt it. So I don't want it to just be a cognitive belief system. It very much is about faith, and the panentheistic point of view will, this face of God in the face of the world should be something that definitely compels you from the heart and the soul. So on that level, yeah, if we don't talk about religions, and you brought that up well, right? But faith traditions, that might be a way in which religion could be a much better motivator. I hope that answered the question.
To respond to that, I'm not against people loving things. I'm not, I don't think it's bad for people to have a passionate faith to protect the earth. I think that's better than not having that, especially as it informs their political aims and other things and what they support, especially in a democracy where people's values really matter for what we do. But what I worry about in these discussions is the automatic assumed effect of loving something. So what I always imagine is you have some city dweller, someone who lives in the heart of a giant metropolis, and they hate nature. It's dirty, there's bugs, they don't want to go out in it. And so they just stay in the city. And so what they do is they walk to work, they take public transportation, they live in a building that shares a heat plant with and cooling with other people, and it's very efficient sort of way to live, environmentally less impactful. And then they convert to a deep love of nature. And so they start traveling to go hiking in national parks, and they move out to the country, and they have to buy it 4-wheel drive because they live in Vermont and it snows now. And they're, so it doesn't seem at all automatic to me that someone appreciating nature is going to be better for it. It is very difficult to avoid harming nature. And I think until we change the systems, until we change the infrastructure, until we change the way that energy is produced at a national and international level, it's very difficult for discretionary choices based on values to make a significant difference.
If I could respond real quick, because I think that lover of nature you described is exploiting nature, that she's using it as a commodity for her pleasure, right? If you love nature and you want to care for it and tend to it, you won't move out into it if it will cause it harm, right? I'm a city dweller. I love nature and I will not leave Manhattan, right? I'm born in Manhattan. I live in Manhattan. I'm a New Yorker, right? But I love nature. And, you know, I don't want to own a car again, right? I do enjoy hiking, but, you know, I think that a true sense of concern, a reverence for nature, right? Not just love in the kind of English pleasure sense, like, oh, you know, like I love cannolis, which I say that a lot, right? Or I love pizza, but this sense of responsibility that then you can enjoy hiking, but you know that if you moved out there and bought that, Ford F-150, you'd see nature more, but it wouldn't be good for nature. Kind of like maybe a parent who's like, maybe we could fathom some overprotective parent, right? Like a helicopter mom or something that is overbearing and harms the child, right? So that it's about curtailing our pleasure sense of love and actually being a responsible lover of the object of our affection, so to speak.
One short technical question to Chris and the larger question to Valdi. The short question is, you mentioned the distinction between pantheism and panentheism. I must say that also as a student of philosophy, I never understood exactly the difference. I mean, even if you go deeper and deeper, and regarding the environment and religion, I don't see exactly how it works, because you see, Michelangelo, who painted the Sistine Chapel, so every drop of paint, every figure is somehow Michelangelo's. Like God creating the world. And so you can see Michelangelo in every part of that painting, whatever your resolution is. So what's the difference between that and a God living in its creation, what you call pantheism? Judaism and I think Catholic versions of Christianity don't hold it in that way, you know, the creation.
That's an excellent question, and I'm not going to do it sufficient justice, right? Because it's a huge question. But the short answer is, the more standard view, the non-panentheistic view of a creator and creation, yeah, it's more like the Michelangelo example, right? There's kind of a spark of Michelangelo's creativity, right, in the Sistine Chapel. And in that sense, there's, God's creativity can be found in creation. Where it goes further is that within the Orthodox tradition, we see creation as continual. We don't speak about it was created once upon a time, so that it's continually being brought forth. This is also the emphasis on regeneration, so that every time any kind of life force, even abiotic cosmic existence, planets come into being, black holes, everything, that's continual creation. So in the sense, the world wasn't created, it is being created constantly. In that sense, that sort of the ordering principles that bring that forth, the teleologies we find in nature, the vitality, the energies that are moving those things forward. We see that as you know, of divine origin. And that's where it's panentheistic. And to try to do justice to your question, but not take up too much time, the main distinction between that and pantheism is the end product, the natural world, us, we are not God, even though there's these energies and divine principles within us, right? It's trying to balance the transcendence, but we take the immanence seriously. That idea of incarnation, the immanence of God seriously. But then it's this continual immanence. So on that level, what is being worshipped is the source of the creation rather than the creation itself. So the panentheist goes beyond reverence for the natural world and worships the natural world. The panentheist can revere nature without worshiping nature, because we see nature, just like ourselves, as fallible, imperfect, right? The source of all creation is perfect, but nature is not perfect. We're not perfect. And that's, we also don't have original sin, right? So we interpret the fall. I like to say the fall is our fallibility. And our fallibility harmed nature early on, right? And the fallen state of nature, right, because that came up earlier, is us doing harm to it, but it also is imperfect. So we share that with nature, right? This imperfection. And so you don't worship something that's imperfect. I hope that helped answer the question, because it was a packed question.
Okay, and to complete, I don't think that the story of Potter and anthropocentrism is the tragedy of bioethics in the last 50 years. I think that the George Washington project is Georgetown, sorry, a project is a big success. And my point, which I raised already this morning, is that I am for division of labor. I think that it's very productive that we deal differently in questions of medical ethics, you know, the Georgetown project, and with environmental ethics. And I think it's even dangerous that we believe that we can use the same tools to deal with nature as we deal with human beings. So I think it needs much care, you know, before we make one discipline out of these two branches, if you like, of what's today called bioethics. And I personally believe that climate change is not really a bioethical problem in that traditional sense. Although it has some repercussions on human health, but so does poverty in general. And still, we don't think that social justice in general is a part of bioethics.
I think we do. Okay, so two answers. The first one is that I am not calling for the two to converge into one. I'm calling for building better bridges, because I think that what bioethics has to contribute to environmental ethics is a focus on the implications for human health and for population health. So I highlighted bioethics maturity to include public health ethics, to point to the fact that the climate crisis obviously will have implications for individuals, but more importantly for populations, and that bioethics has developed the tools to deal with that. So I'm just calling bioethics to shed particular light on certain aspects of environmental ethics, partly because these will become increasingly the most painful and tragic aspects that environmental ethics deals with, the cost in human life and human suffering. And partly because I think it's a really strong weapon politically, because what might motivate action is pointing light onto human suffering. So again, not calling for convergence, but rather for better communication between the fields. And now I want to say more at a higher level, speak to your call for division of labor, which I believe is misguided. So on this, we truly disagree very respectfully. I see bioethics, often I think of it as a child that became an adolescent and is now finally approaching adult age. So I think its origins were theological. And then as a teenage, sorry, I'm raising 2 teenagers right now, so I'm very sensitive to all of this. It has to distance itself from its origins and find its own identity. And I see the focus on individual autonomy and individualism as sort of a knee-jerk reaction to the circumstances of its birth. And I think what I see as the not just the evolution, but the maturity of the field is in the development of what I see not just as novel, but more sophisticated tools, such as from autonomy to relational autonomy, the integration of ethics of care, the move towards narrative ethics, using it. Paul asked about how to make bioethics into activism. That's also an emerging issue in bioethics today. Are we supposed to be activists, or are we supposed to be researchers looking from the outside at their objects of research? So all these issues of how to mobilize narrative and how to mobilize emotion into bioethics activism, and how to see the self as relational. What place communitarian theories deserve within bioethics? I see all this as advancement towards a more mature, sophisticated field that should at the same time open up towards what used to be seen as outside its scope, and now it's expanding, and all these things need to be integrated. And that includes social determinants of health, and that includes social justice and global justice, and that includes climate change. So from the perspective of human health, always. So to me, that's the future of bioethics. That's the future that I am pushing towards in my own research and activism. And I think the focus that you want to see is very important and should remain, but it's one of many.
So my question is for Chris, but it's in light of the, let's say, examination of conscience that both Professor Randit and Professor Bar have undertaken, right? So my question is this: I think it's easy to sort of sit here as academics or theologians and present a very nice picture of what the members of our religious traditions should think and therefore act with regard to the environment, right? So you've talked about how the Orthodox tradition sees creation, continuous creation, and I can talk, we didn't have a Catholic presentation today, but along similar lines, continuous creation, the Franciscan tradition, 800 years, etc., etc., etc. The question is, in practice, has this trickled down, or to what extent has this trickled down? And I give an example of those who are at the lunch table with me, that we Catholics have the practice of confession, right? I have never had someone come to me and confess environmental sins. I have never had someone come to me and say, bless me, Father, for I have sinned. I left the air conditioner running for too long, etc., etc. We have very clear, at least in the Catholic tradition, we know, what sins in the sexual realm are, life issues are. Environmental issues, I don't think that awareness has trickled down to the Catholic population at large. Right? So we can talk about Laudato Si, we can talk about Benedict XVI, who was called the Green Pope before Francis, we can talk about the Franciscan tradition, we can talk about all of these things at the theoretical level. My question is in practice, in the Orthodox tradition? Has it really taken root? Is it really affecting the way that the majority are making their real life decisions?
Sadly, no. But to speak to Vardit, sadly, no, right? Not in neither church. But I think that is the moment of greening our faiths, right? That we need to be activists as well, right? And to me, you know, whether it's whether they're separate or they find ways to be bridged, environmental ethics, bioethics, they're practical ethics, right? Business ethics, they all need to be talking with one another. We didn't talk enough about the economic and commodification slide, but in my opinion, right? But these things need some level of action, right? Because we're not just moral philosophers who are, you know, coming up with nice theories, but these are supposed to be practically applicable, so to speak, right? So on that level, I don't think that, let's say, eco-theologians have done a good enough job, right? Getting that message on the pulpits, if we're speaking about the Christian tradition, right? Not enough sermons are given on the Day for Care of Creation, right? Even on a weekday, very few priests, even though they're holding a service, right? They're not putting it in the bulletin and making a big issue of it, right? We need to be teaching environmental and ecological sin in the catechism. It needs to be part of seminary training, right? So that people are aware of it and they come and start confessing their environmental sins, right? That's exactly what John Chrysaviers and Patriarch Bartholomew would love to see. People coming and confessing environmental sin, right? But, you know, we haven't done enough to have that kind of trickle down or, you know, integrate it horizontally across many sectors of the church, right? So I think that is part of the internal activist stance that eco-theologians or just theologians who are, you know, growing more ecologically aware and mindful of the climate crisis need to be doing that sort of work, right? So that we can bring that into the parishes. And I think the Laudato Si movement in the Catholic world on a grassroots level has been really burgeoning and growing. I give Lenten lectures, for instance, for a number of years now in the Orthodox world. So during Lent, some people give talks on other things, but if I'm asked to give a talk on fasting, I speak about our food ethics and our relation to food and farming and agriculture and our food choices and the environmental decisions. And I try to tie that in my Lenten lectures into ecological sin. I want to see more eco-theologians, not just, you know, sitting around writing papers, but getting out into the parishes and doing that sort of stuff, you know? I think the Laudato Si movement is something within your church that has really impressed me on a lay level. And I think things are starting to move in the right direction. It's it's not too late. I wish it happened earlier, but I'm gonna remain hopeful, you know, that we can keep that momentum going.
So it's actually, I'd like to hear your response to Professor Barr's Protestant realism. I mean, as a Catholic, I would say that idea that, you know, religions have actually very little influence, I mean, coming it down, is Protestant pessimism, what the Catholics would call Protestant pessimism, right? We would argue that I was the realist. I'm just saying, those are internal discussions, right? I just want your take as an Orthodox Christian people,
well,
anthropological.
I mean, I gave him a little pushback on that, but I mean, to go a little further, well, sometimes it fails. I think part of the problem is Protestants' individualism, and they're concerned with individual salvation. And the lack of panentheism in the Protestant worldview, and a view of God that is not the Orthodox view of God, to speak about internal differences, right? When God is conceptualized more as a man, and who, you know, and it's conceptualized in terms of individual salvation without a deep interdependence and interrelationality with creation. I think that's where there can be less mobilization. On the other hand, not to take things totally away from Protestantism, figures like, you know, MLK, right? He's a Protestant and he creates the civil rights movement, right? He's, you know, a great rebuttal case, right? That a Protestant,
oh, no.
right?
He's a Niebuhrian realist. He could quote Niebuhr paragraph.
But that's religion enacting social change right there. So like that is a very effective moment. So on the one hand, you know, yeah, all right, I have my critiques of, you know, why Protestantism might not be able to enact change, but then you have these great examples, and I can't think of a better one than the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King, enacting social change. He's still an effective figure today. He's a martyr essentially for civil rights, and he's a Protestant. So I really do think that faith traditions, right? Like I disagree with this claim empirically. And the Laudato Si movement that's growing all over the global South, all over the world, you know, even the different Catholic movements that reject the neoliberal economy and create, you know, like communes of Catholics, you know, using barter systems and stuff. You know, secular hippies were not half as successful as Catholic hippies, right? Essentially. So I give pushback against that realistic
Can I
claim.
clarify your response to that?
Yeah,
I think I'm just worried about a big misunderstanding of what I'm saying. Because if you think MLK is a rebuttal, he's exactly the sort of thing I would endorse as a Christian realist, because he didn't just try to convince people, right? He didn't just like go to the white supremacists and say, hey, can I tell you about Jesus? He did boycotts, he did sit-ins, nonviolent direct action. So he was doing the sort of political action and coercive pressure on society that brought about change. And what changed things were changes in laws, the National Guard, you know, the paramilitary groups in the US going into the South and opening the schools. Yeah. So so if you think I'm against that sort of religious activism, I think you misunderstood.
Okay,
me.
sorry.
That's precisely the sort of thing that I think works, as opposed to just persuasion.
See, and I think that's belief incarnate, right? That's faith in action, that's embodied faith. And that was my point A critique, right? When belief is thought of only cognitively, and we get too individualized, and it's about how I believe, what I think, what I did as a person, and then like, hey, God, forgive me at the end of the day, I'll sin, I'll go back home, you know, pray at the corner of my bed. And, you know, that does lead to no change. But I think that's not real faith, right? It's right, like real faith is embodied, right? So, all right, then I'll give you less pushback. Sorry for a misunderstanding. And that's part of our fallen state, my fallibility.
And my lack of clarity.
Okay, I have a confession to make. I turned on my air conditioning this morning before I came to the conference, so something happened. Anyway, you're next, and then that's all right.
Okay. Thank you very much. It's a very interesting discussion. I think you have to remember that politicians are individuals and that they make big decisions which affect a lot of people, but they actually do have religious beliefs that affect them. So I think that's important to remember, that if you can persuade a politician about something, or they can develop a stronger faith or whatever, it can influence a lot of decision making about the environment. So that's something I want to say. to do with love and how that propels people to action. What does that love mean? To what extent does love get enacted as a love of following what God has ordered or commanded? And according to Islam, the word word means command of God. So you're talking about it meaning order of the universe, that's logos. But in Islam, the word word is in the Quran with a capital W, and I find it very interesting that it actually means the command of God. So Jesus was created with a command of God, by a command of God. So when people really love God, they are grateful for, you know, existing and grateful for their life and grateful for everything around them, and then they want to, or if they recognize the wisdom of God's commands, they want to obey them, and also they know that they are accountable to God. And I think that's something which I'm quite interested in finding out about, is how much accountability is there in each of these traditions, you know, Protestantism and Greek Orthodox Church, because a lot of Christianity seems to talk about belief being your source of salvation, you know, belief in the Trinity, belief in salvation through Jesus being the source of forgiveness, whereas the accountability? You know, that's also a motivation, knowing that you're accountable on the day of judgment for everything you do and say. So if you have that accountability, that will motivate you to do something. It's not just love that makes people accountable, or makes people motivated. If you love, you know, nature, you're motivated to protect it, but also if you know you're accountable for how you use it, that will also motivate you. So I want to know what kind of accountability there is in those.
Yeah, you feel it first.
So, I mean, this is, my wife grew up in the Catholic Church and she was criticizing me for this last week. But Protestants tend to see the law of God as one of its main functions is to teach us humility because we can't follow it. So the idea, like, that's why it's there, you know. So you can go through the 10 Commandments and they all seem, okay, I haven't killed anyone much, you know, and all these things. But you get to number 10 says, do not covet, and you realize you're lost, right? Because everybody covets all the time. And so one of the Protestant understandings of the use of the law is that it's a pedagogical use and it teaches us humility before God, and that our only hope for favor from God is forgiveness. And so, whereas I think Catholics tend to think that the grace of God allows you to be better, and then you are somewhat judged on the fruit of that. You rely on God for redemption, but then you are somewhat judged on your how you do. Protestants, Luther says Christians are simultaneously sinner and saint. Sinner because we continue to sin, but saint because we are forgiven for that. So it gets a little bit. Muslims aren't supposed to drink; they don't drink. You know, Christians aren't supposed to do a lot of things. Protestants, we tend to do them, and so yeah, you're right. It doesn't motivate as much. Though there are, I'll say real quick, and I'll be done. Social accountability within Protestant communities is often very effective. So if you look at, say, the American Amish or Mennonite communities that practice shunning and strict social regulation, they very effectively have resisted technology and things that are ecologically damaging. But peer pressure works for us, yeah.
It's an excellent question, and again, it's tricky. The relationship, so the commandments, the Mosaic law, right, in the Orthodox tradition is seen as the schoolmaster unto Christ, to quote Galatians, Paul, right? It's this preparatory steps towards virtue. It teaches us consciousness of sin, consciousness of justice, right? And then you're supposed to go beyond it, right, to a life of virtue. So the law is the schoolmaster to virtue. And this idea of growth, like you're talking about, like bioethics as a teenager, right? It's kind of like we see law as important, right? Christ came to fulfill the law, but not abandon it, right? But I love her teenage model because it's essentially how we see rule following. You're supposed to be a good person, not just a rule follower. So the idea is that you don't want to not murder if you're murderous on the inside, you still have not transfigured yourself, and hence you can't have salvation, right? Because you're still murderous on the inside. You're still keeping a good socially just world by not murdering, right? But just like, it's like with kids, you tell them, why can't I do that? Because mommy and daddy said so. But by the time they're 17, you hope that they're not, and you're not around, you hope that they've developed conscience and a sense of virtue, that they want to be a good person and understand the reasons behind the law. So this is where it's tricky, that the responsibility is kind of responding to the other, getting to a place where you respond to the needs of the other. In the case of what we're talking about, that's other species, that's the earth as a whole, that's humans who are affected negatively by climate change, even if you are not, right? And that's where compassion, right, is not just like, it's this rich concept of agape, love, right? And philanthropia, love of the person, right? But it's also, right, a sort of philoecolia, right? Or a biophilia, to quote E.O. Wilson, where you're acting in loving kindness, to borrow a term from Buddhism, towards the other. And it's a responsibility, as opposed to an obligation. Because yes, the Orthodox tradition is not a dutiful, legalistic view of Christianity. That can be helpful, right? It can, but yeah, it's more of a virtue-based tradition. So the hope would be that you feel responsible, right? And yeah, I don't know if that's adequate, but yeah.
So the solution is to help people to strengthen their empathy.
Yeah, and there's
Strengthening empathy.
And being constantly mindful of the need of the other, so that you can respond on the spot, right? And this is, constant knowledge of the environment, right? Studying it, being aware of it, being ecologically aware. In the Greek tradition, we call it nipsis. It's very close. It's part of our meditative prayer tradition, which is all about silencing and emptying your mind of your ego, so that you can then be aware of surroundings and, for us, get filled with God, right? But that state of watchfulness, constant watchfulness and awareness of your thoughts and surroundings is called nipsis. And it's actually quite close to Buddhist understanding of mindfulness. So by cultivating that, you're constantly aware of the needs of the other, and then you respond compassionately out of love. And so that's our view of responsibility. So it's closer to Buddhism than it is to Islam, actually.
Islam has that aspect of it, obviously there's various strands to motivation in Islam, like there's the accountability, there's a strong description and understanding of the judgment. We also have the fact that everything is a reflection of God, so we love nature because it's reflecting God and helping us to understand God. But also, we have this idea of muraqabah, which is reflecting and holding yourself to account and reflecting your actions. And that should, and thinking about how much you're harming others or benefiting others in everything you're saying and doing. That's part of this, Islamic purification. It's interesting to hear how spiritual your tradition is.
Let me add something, because you remind me about. I read one's article, and he offered an alternative to help for Christian, or to help solve the ecological crisis. In this paper, in this article, he doesn't use the term. It seems that he even didn't like to use the term pantheism, but he used the term panpsychism. Pankashisu, it means consciousness is everywhere. I think it's quite close to what you are speaking, both of you are speaking. Actually, his article is very short. At first, I read, I could not understand. I would like to add that even though I like sincerity of Protestantism, I also find hope in Christianity because you are more rational. In Thai Buddhism, we like to speak about interdependence. Everything is dependent, interdependent, dependent origination. But in fact, most of Buddhists focus on the concept of impermanence and no self and non-substantiality. Why should we care about the environment if everything is impermanent? If everything is transient, just temporary, and is going to be perished a day sooner or later. So many of us, many Buddhists in Thailand are told to practice more and more, focus on meditation, and we are told to practice more and try to achieve the final liberation as soon as possible. It seems that we have faith, but I think we are not quite rational. So, and to some extent, not or but more or less, I think there is also a tendency of anthropocentrism in Thai Buddhism.
Interesting. I mean, when I read Zan's paper, I think she mentioned about that. So tomorrow, after you hear about that Buddhist position, which is actually she also talked about that emphasis on the impermanence and spiritual enlightenment as the goal, and so basically a little bit of what you just said. So we said we'll be very much appreciated when we speak of it.
Well, I have one kind of comment for David. Well, I took a note. You said something of Protestant realism and some kind of skeptical stance toward the power of argument. My comment and some kind of more direct coercive means. Well, my comment is that Buddhism has some kind of more direct coercive means also, and I wonder to what extent do you think this is unique to Protestantism? That's the question. Because in Thailand we also have laws protecting the environment, law against people throwing wastes into the river and canals and so on, the same as in other countries. So perhaps the call for the more coercive measures is one thing, and how we justify those coercive measures based on our traditions or based on some kind of philosophical theorization. It could be another thing. Perhaps you might want to comment on that. And a question for Sumali. I took also a note. You said something about you would like to see a more horizontal connection with nature rather than the vertical one with the divine. How is that going to, become forceful? Because the divine, we have listened to the theistic traditions, Jewish, Islam, Christian traditions, there is God, and God either put human beings with the task of protecting the environment, and human beings have duties to do so because God either commanded or entrusted human beings to do so. But with the horizontal connection, I mean, how can we find the force so that human beings feel that we are compelled to protect the environment, for example?
Actually, in my paper, I would like to show the existential crisis in human being. We are struggling between one side, we are part of the nature, and the other side, we can make sense of nature by staying apart from nature. So we have two conflict self, or conflict beings, being a part of nature and being something apart from nature in order to get some meanings and value. So I may not have the answer right now, but it motivates me to think and do more research. That if we would like to have meaning in the horizontal dimension with nature, how can it be possible? Because as I told in the paper, in the world of atoms, proton, electron, we have no value, we have no meanings, but we want to have meaning and value. Can it be possible in the horizon, sorry, it's very difficult for me to have some pronunciation. How can it be? I think that in the morning, if I ask a question about the intrinsic value. I think that the problem is not at God's creation. If you say that God's creation is limited or imperfect, I think it can be a way out, because the concept of fall and redemption, not talk about the concept of creation. In the concept of fall and redemption, we may find a way to make our connection horizon with nature. Horizontally. Thank you very much.
David, if I make one sentence. Suraj, my version of Christianity was not captured by your what you said about Christianity. The answer to your question, what she was answering, is panentheism. That is how you achieve horizontal transcendence. I've said that in Orthodox theological things like for years. That is our understanding of transcendence. It's not just vertical. It's a cross. It's vertical and it's horizontal, right? God is in the face of God is in the world. That's how you transcend horizontally, and it's how you preserve intrinsic value. Right? And yeah, that's so. I just wanted to say the basic answer to your question is Greek Orthodoxy.
Thank you for that.
Sorry.
I want to answer your question about whether or not I think this notion of the relative impotence of persuasion versus coercion is unique to Protestantism. This may not have been clear in my method because I didn't talk about my method, but I believe that the fact that religious and cultural values are a poor predictor of environmental outcomes and lack explanatory value for explaining environmental history. I think that's just a historical fact. I don't think that comes from Protestantism. So I think it is much more effective to understand environmental history, to understand geologic and geographic features and biological ones. It affects what sort of technologies develop. And I think technology is developing in response to physical factors tend to influence religion at least as much as the other way around. So I don't think that's a Protestant discovery. I think that's just, if you look at anthropology and paleogenetics and the spread of humans across the globe. What Protestantism does for me is I think it helps inculcate me against what I see as an overly optimistic view of the power of ideas and ideals. And so I think it helps me to see that history clearly, but I don't think the history comes from Protestantism. I want to say real quickly that in response to what you said, Reinhold Niebuhr starts one of his books with the sentence, man is both in and out of the flux of nature and time. And there's a strain within Christian thinking that talks about the mystery of humankind being our eternal and embodied existence, being a profound mystery. And I think that challenge of understanding our natural and supernatural existence is fundamental to understanding the general condition of human environmental life.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, last question because red there. Okay.
So the question, but just to add on to the conversation we are doing, kinds of a horizontal sort of connections between what God create and then what how we make it is no God. Example, validation, what is this no God? How we make sense of all these things going on. I guess when we are talking about Buddhism, is one of the very one kind which deny the existence of God. And in that sense, how we make sense of human and nature is that we are in part and parcel. Now, generally, we have an ego-centric, just as an ego, when you have ego, there is someone who created. But what Buddhism look at the things is that we are the eco-centric. Human is a part and parcel of this nature. We are all elements. All the human as a tree, this tree has 4 elements, same as we are. So when we look at this ourselves and as nature and everything as this building, it depends on how we are going to use in this sense of the in transition, because things are always changing. And we are changing at all the time. But how we live in sense of this always changing and changing impermanent. So how we live without that having impact on that tree, on that whatever it's plant, as well as us. So that is how we make sense of these two things.
Okay. Thank you.